Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and the planet tells its oldest stories in a voice soft enough for the end of the day. Tonight, we are travelling to a green bend in the Irish countryside, to a place that spends most of the year in stillness, tucked beneath grass, stone and weather, waiting for one very particular sunrise. It is called Newgrange, and at first glance, you might think it is simply a great round mound resting in the Boyne Valley, quiet as a sleeping hill and patient as a cat pretending not to hear you opening the biscuit tin. But once a year, when winter has pulled the longest night over the northern hemisphere, this ancient monument does something remarkable. It wakes up, not with bells or moving parts, not with gears, switches, lanterns, or any of the usual little tricks humans use when we're trying to impress each other, but with sunlight. A narrow beam enters through a carefully made opening above the doorway and travels down a long stone passage into the dark heart of the monument. For a short time, the inner chamber, sealed away from ordinary daylight, receives the rising winter sun. Then the beam fades, the chamber returns to shadow, and Newgrange settles back into its long, quiet waiting. It is a yearly appointment kept between stone and sky, and somehow the calendar was written there more than 5,000 years ago. Before we wander any farther into that passage, I would love to know where in the world are you listening from tonight, and if you happen to know, what season is outside your window right now. Maybe it is winter where you are, and the nights feel long enough to have their own postcode. Maybe it is warm and bright, and the idea of a cold solstice morning in Ireland feels as distant as a woolly jumper in July. Or perhaps you're listening from a city where the sky is mostly hidden by roofs and windows, and the sunrise arrives not as a grand event, but as a pale glow between buildings, quietly doing its best. That is one of the comforting things about a place like Newgrange. It reminds us that long before alarm clocks, weather apps, railway timetables, and that slightly accusatory calendar notification that appears 5 minutes too late, people were already paying close attention to the sky. They noticed where the sun rose. They watched how its path changed through the seasons. They felt the year tighten into darkness and then loosen again toward light. And rather than simply noting this with a shrug and perhaps a sensible fur cloak, they built something vast, heavy, and precise enough to hold that moment in stone. If you find this kind of journey soothing, interesting, or simply a gentle way to let the day put down its bags, I would be grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this quiet little corner of Earth reach other curious travellers, especially the ones who enjoy learning about ancient monuments at a pace that will not frighten the teacups. And if this story sends you to sleep before we reach the chamber, that is perfectly all right. Newgrange has waited 5,000 years for sunlight. It will not mind waiting a little longer for you. So, settle in. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the room around you become less important for a while. We are going to follow a river into the past, not quickly, not with maps flapping in the wind and someone shouting about parking, but slowly, as if walking through damp grass at dawn. Our destination is Brúna Boyne, the bend of the Boyne, a landscape in County Meath where the River Boyne curves through fields and low hills, and where some of the most extraordinary monuments of prehistoric Europe still sit close to one another, Newgrange, Knowth, Dowth, and many smaller sites scattered through the valley. It is not just one monument standing alone like a forgotten prop from an old myth. It is a whole ancient landscape layered with human attention. Newgrange itself is a passage tomb, though even that phrase feels a little too small for what it is. A tomb, yes, because human remains were found there, and because the dead were certainly part of its purpose. A passage, yes, because a narrow corridor leads inward through the mound. But it is also an astronomical instrument, a ceremonial place, a feat of engineering, a work of art, and perhaps a carefully staged encounter with the returning sun. Calling it a passage tomb is accurate, but it is a bit like calling a cathedral a building with windows. Technically correct, but not quite awake to the full business of the thing. From the outside, Newgrange has a simple shape that becomes less simple the longer you look at it. It is a broad circular mound covered in grass, ringed by large curbstones, with a bright reconstructed front wall of pale quartz and darker rounded stones. It looks at once ancient and oddly fresh, as if a hill addressed neatly for an important visitor. The mound is about the size of something you would definitely not want to move by hand, which is unfortunate, because moving things by hand is precisely what its builders had to do. There were no cranes, no trucks, no metal machinery, no convenient little forklift beeping cheerfully in the Neolithic morning. Just people, tools of stone, wood, bone, rope, patience, skill, and a very serious commitment to a project that was not going to be finished before lunch. And this is where Newgrange begins to tug gently at the mind. It was built around 3200 BCE, which means it was already ancient before Stonehenge reached its famous form, and before the Great Pyramids of Egypt rose from the desert. That fact is often repeated, and for good reason. It rearranges our mental furniture a little. We tend to imagine the deep past as a dim preface to the real story of civilization, as if people were simply waiting around for writing, bronze and reasonably comfortable chairs. But Newgrange refuses that idea. It stands there, older than many of the monuments we instinctively think of as oldest, and says in its quiet, grassy way that people of the Neolithic world were capable of planning, measuring, organising, building, remembering and thinking on a scale that still makes modern visitors fall silent. Of course, they did not build Newgrange for tourists with raincoats and camera phones. They built it for reasons we can only partly understand. Archaeology gives us evidence, but not the complete inner life of the people who made it. We can measure the passage, we can study the stones, we can examine the cremated remains, the carved symbols, the orientation toward the winter solstice sunrise, and the relationship of the monument to the wider landscape. But no one left us a diary saying today we moved another enormous stone, and honestly my back is beginning to have opinions. There are no written instructions pinned politely beside the entrance. The builders lived before writing in Ireland, so their meanings have to be approached through material traces, through comparison, through careful excavation, and through a certain amount of humble uncertainty. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of what makes the place so compelling. Newgrange does not hand us all its answers neatly wrapped. It lets us know enough to be astonished and leaves enough unsaid to keep us respectful. We know that the builders cared about the dead. We know they cared about the movement of the sun. We know they gathered stones from different places and arranged them with intention. We know that the monument required cooperation across time, perhaps across generations. We know that the winter solstice mattered enough to be built into the architecture. But when we ask what it felt like to stand there on the morning the light arrived, we have to lean into imagination carefully, like opening an old door that might creak. Picture the valley in winter, not as a postcard, but as a lived place. The air is cold, the ground is wet, smoke may rise from nearby settlements. People know the dark season not as an aesthetic, but as a real challenge. Food must last, weather matters, daylight is short. The sun has been rising lower and lower, travelling a shorter arc across the sky, giving less warmth and leaving earlier each evening like a guest who has remembered another appointment. Then comes the turning point, the shortest day, the long night, the moment after which the sun begins, almost imperceptibly, to return. To us, the winter solstice can be marked with a date on a calendar, a news article, perhaps a cheerful social media post saying the days will get longer now, which is comforting even if it is still raining sideways. But for people living close to the land, close to animals, crops, hunger, weather, and the stubborn fact of survival, the return of the sun was not a decorative thought. It mattered. It meant the year had not collapsed into endless darkness. It meant the cycle still held. It meant that the world, despite appearances, was not finished with light. Newgrange seems to gather all of that into one narrow line of sunrise. The entrance faces southeast toward the place where the sun rises around the winter solstice. Above the doorway is the roof box, a small opening built so that sunlight can enter even when the main entrance itself remains lower and darker. This detail is one of the reasons Newgrange feels almost uncannily deliberate. The light does not simply spill in because someone forgot to close a gap. It is guided. It enters like a visitor who knows the route. It travels along a passage about 19 metres long, reaches the chamber, and briefly illuminates a space that is otherwise cut off from direct sunlight. And then, after those few minutes of golden intrusion, it is gone. There is something wonderfully practical and wonderfully strange about that. The builders did not create a monument that shines every day. They did not flood it with light at every dawn, as if worried people might miss the point. They made something selective, something that responds to a specific moment in the year. Most mornings, Newgrange remains dark inside. Most mornings, the sun passes without entering the chamber in that particular way. The monument is not asleep because it is forgotten. It is asleep because it is waiting for the right angle, and perhaps that is why it captures modern imagination so easily. We live in a world that often insists everything should be available immediately. Messages arrive instantly. Lights switch on whenever we ask. Music, maps, food, films, opinions, socks we do not remember ordering, all summoned with a few taps. Newgrange belongs to another rhythm entirely. It does not perform on demand, at least not in its original relationship with the sky. It waits for the year to turn. It waits through spring brightness, summer height, autumn fading, and winter dark. Then, if the clouds allow, it opens itself to sunrise. Not because someone pressed a button, but because Earth has tilted, orbited, and arrived again. That if the clouds allow is important, and also very Irish. The monument may be perfectly aligned, the stones may have waited faithfully, the people may have gathered in excitement, but the weather can still stroll in wearing a grey coat and say, "Not today, thank you." The winter solstice event at Newgrange depends on actual sunlight. A cloudy morning can soften or hide the beam entirely. There is a lesson in that, though perhaps not the kind that fits neatly on a fridge magnet. Ancient precision met natural uncertainty. Human planning met weather. Even the most careful monument cannot negotiate with clouds, which is probably just as well since clouds seem like difficult committee members. Still, the possibility of the light is enough to pull people back year after year. Today, visitors hope to witness the solstice illumination, much as ancient people may have gathered to witness it, though with warmer coats, stricter visitor numbers, and considerably more photography. Those allowed inside during the solstice mornings are selected because the space is small and the interest is enormous. Outside, others gather in the cold, waiting for sunrise over the Boyne Valley, taking part in a tradition that is modern and ancient at once. Nobody today can claim to experience Newgrange exactly as its builders did, but the same sun rises, the same turning of the year occurs, the same brief drama of darkness giving way to light continues to do its quiet work on the human chest. It would be easy to make Newgrange sound mysterious in a vague way, as if mystery were a fog machine one could switch on whenever the past appears. But the more interesting mystery is not that ancient people did something impossible. They did not. They did something human. They observed carefully. They built intelligently. They joined memory, death, season, community, and sky into one structure. That is not a supernatural puzzle. It is a human achievement, and in many ways that makes it more moving. We do not need to imagine lost magic to be impressed by Newgrange. The real work is impressive enough. Because think of the practicalities. Stones had to be chosen, transported, raised, balanced, and fitted. The mound had to be built so it stayed stable and dry. The passage had to point in the right direction. The roof box had to admit the low winter sun. The chamber had to be enclosed in darkness and yet open, on certain mornings to light. The builders needed knowledge accumulated across years, maybe across lifetimes. Someone had to notice the sun's behaviour. Someone had to remember it. Someone had to persuade others that this mattered enough to become architecture. And then many hands had to carry the idea into stone. There is a quiet intimacy in that. Every large ancient monument is also a record of small human actions. A hand placing a stone, a voice giving instructions, someone getting tired, someone laughing at the wrong moment, someone looking at the sunrise and thinking, yes, there. We often speak of prehistoric builders as if they were a category rather than people. But Newgrange was not made by the past in general. It was made by individuals with bodies that ached, families that needed feeding, weather they complained about, and minds capable of astonishing patience. They may have lived in a world very different from ours, but they were not dim or distant in their intelligence. They were present, practical, and observant, probably with at least one person in the group who was very particular about measurements and slightly exhausting during meetings. The carvings on the stones deepen that sense of presence. Newgrange is famous for its megalithic art, especially spirals, lozenges, circles, arcs, and other forms carved into stone surfaces. Some are outside, including the richly decorated entrance stone, and some are inside the monument, hidden from ordinary view. We do not know exactly what these patterns meant. They may relate to cosmology, ritual, landscape, altered states, family groups, memory, or things we have not guessed correctly at all. But they tell us that the monument was not merely assembled, it was marked. Its stones were given surfaces that invited attention. The builders did not only move rock, they shaped meaning into it. And that brings us back to the idea of the ancient monument that wakes up once a year. It is not that Newgrange is alive in the ordinary sense, of course. It does not breathe under the grass or stretch its curbstones in the morning, though that is a charming image and probably a concern for conservation staff. It wakes because its design becomes active at a particular time. For most of the year, its deepest chamber remains in darkness. Then the winter sunrise unlocks something the architecture has been holding all along. The monument's purpose, or at least one of its purposes, becomes visible. It is a machine without metal, a calendar without paper, a memory device large enough to enter. Yet even that description, useful as it is, may still be too modern. A machine suggests that the builders simply wanted a result. A calendar suggests they only wanted to mark a date. But Newgrange may have been more than a tool. It may have been a place where the living met the dead, where the returning sun entered a chamber associated with ancestors, where the year's darkest moment became a ceremony of renewal. We should be careful here, because we cannot climb inside Neolithic belief and switch on the lights. But the architecture gives us permission to say that light and darkness were arranged with care. Whatever else Newgrange meant, the winter sunrise was not an accident. So tonight, as we begin this slow walk into the Boyne Valley, we are not only visiting an archaeological site, we are visiting a question built from earth and stone. What did ancient people know by watching the sky that many of us have forgotten by looking at clocks? What does it mean to build for one sunrise rather than for constant use? Why place the dead, the dark, and the returning light in conversation with one another? And why does a beam of sunlight entering a stone chamber after 5,000 winters still feel, even now, like something worth gathering for? The first answer is simple enough. Newgrange is beautiful, old, and rare. But simple answers do not keep us company for long. The deeper answer is that Newgrange makes time visible. Not digital time, not the tidy time of appointments and delivery windows, but seasonal time. Earth time. The kind of time that moves through frost, seeds, rivers, bones, and sunrise. It reminds us that a year is not just a number changing at the top of a document. It is a physical journey made by the planet, and our ancestors watched that journey closely enough to build a doorway for light at its darkest turn. For now, let us stay outside a moment longer, with the river not far away and the mound rising quietly from the land. The grass is damp, the stones are still, the chamber inside is dark. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the sun is doing what it has always done, moving not for us exactly, but with us carried along in the motion, and before we step deeper into the age of Newgrange, before we compare it with monuments that came later and ask what sort of world could produce such a place, it helps to let one fact settle gently. This was not built by a civilization waiting to become clever. It was built by people who already were. Before we step inside Newgrange, it is worth standing outside it for a little while and letting its age properly settle. Not in the quick way we usually handle ancient dates, where a number appears, everyone nods politely, and then the mind immediately goes off to think about whether there is still tea in the cup. I mean really letting it settle. Newgrange was built around 3200 BCE. That places it more than 5,000 years behind us, in a world so far away that even the word ancient begins to feel slightly underdressed for the occasion. It is older than the most familiar form of Stonehenge. It is older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was already resting in the Irish landscape before those famous monuments had fully entered the story. And there is something quietly rearranging about that fact, as if a piece of furniture in the mind has been moved while we were not looking. When people hear that Newgrange is older than Stonehenge and older than the pyramids, it can sound like a competition, as though prehistoric monuments have been entered into some sort of very slow athletics event, with judges holding clipboards and someone announcing Ireland takes the early lead. But the value of the comparison is not really about winning, it is about perspective. Stonehenge and the pyramids occupy such large spaces in our imagination that they often become our mental starting points for monumental architecture. We picture Egypt, with its desert light and limestone blocks, or southern England, with standing stones arranged beneath open sky, and we think, there, that is where ancient grandeur begins. Then Newgrange quietly raises a hand from the Boyne Valley and reminds us that people were already building with astonishing ambition in Atlantic Europe long before those later monuments became what we know today. This does not make Newgrange better. It makes the human story wider. It tells us that the desire to build for memory, for ceremony, for the sky, and for the dead was not limited to one river valley, one desert kingdom, or one famous stone circle. It was part of something much older and much more widespread. Across Neolithic Europe, farming communities were shaping landscapes with earthworks, tombs, standing stones, timber structures and causeways. They were not writing books, carving royal inscriptions or leaving behind lists of kings, but they were building in ways that still speak, even if the language is partly lost. Newgrange is one of the clearest voices in that long, wordless conversation. To understand just how early Newgrange is, it helps to imagine the world around the time it was built. There were no cities in Ireland, no metal tools, no written records, no wheels turning along roads, no horses pulling carts through the valley. The people who made Newgrange lived in the Neolithic period, the later part of the Stone Age, when farming had spread across much of Europe and had reached Ireland generations earlier. They grew crops, kept animals, made pottery, polished stone axes, built houses, gathered in communities, and buried or honoured their dead in ways that required effort far beyond daily survival. Their world was not primitive in the sense people sometimes lazily imagine. It was technologically different from ours, yes, but not simple-minded. They had knowledge of land, weather, timber, stone, animals, seeds, seasons, and the patient behaviour of the sun. They had enough social organisation to build Newgrange, and that alone should make us careful before assuming too little about them. The monument itself is not small. It is a large circular mound of earth and stone surrounded by curbstones, with a passage leading inward to a chamber. From above it would look like a great round presence in the landscape. Not a natural hill exactly, but something made to resemble one. A constructed mound with a clear boundary and a hidden interior. It is the kind of place that makes you ask not only how they built it, but why they built it so decisively. People do not move that much stone casually. Nobody wakes up one damp morning in Neolithic Ireland and says, perhaps after breakfast we shall build a massive passage tomb aligned to the winter solstice, unless a great many other people have already agreed to the plan, or unless that person is unusually persuasive and has access to a frightening amount of rope. The effort must have been enormous. The builders had to collect materials from different parts of the landscape. They had to transport large stones without modern machines. They had to arrange the passage so that it remained structurally stable under the weight of the mound. They had to create a chamber with a corbelled roof, using stones laid in a careful inward-stepping pattern, so the roof could close above the space without collapsing. They had to make the monument weather-resistant enough that it would last not just for a season or a generation, but for thousands of years. Of course, they could not have known exactly how long it would survive. No builder stands at a site and says, "This should be good for 5,000 winters, provided nobody interferes with the drainage." But they clearly built for endurance. Newgrange was not temporary. It was not a stage set. It was meant to remain. And it has remained, though not untouched. Time has pressed on it. People have entered it, altered it, forgotten it, rediscovered it, excavated it, argued over it, restored it, and visited it in great numbers. The Newgrange we see today is not simply the mound as it stood on the first morning after construction. Archaeology is never quite that clean. The monument has a long life, and that life includes both the Neolithic builders and the modern hands that studied and restored it. Still, beneath those later layers is an original achievement of great age and precision. Its winter solstice alignment belongs to the earliest monument, and that is the fact that keeps drawing the mind back. At a time before bronze, before writing, before the great kingdoms that fill school books, people in the Boyne Valley built a structure that could catch a specific sunrise. The comparison with Stonehenge is useful because Stonehenge is so familiar. Yet even Stonehenge is not one single thing built all at once. It developed in phases over many centuries. Its earliest earthwork began around 3000 BCE, and the famous large stone settings came later. So when we say Newgrange is older than Stonehenge, we have to be fair and precise. Newgrange is older than the main stone arrangement most people picture when they hear the name Stonehenge, and it belongs to an earlier moment in the great European tradition of ceremonial monuments. It is not a case of one neat date against another. The past does not arrange itself for convenient comparison like items on a shopping receipt, but the general point remains. Newgrange is remarkably early, and it forces us to place Ireland at the centre of any serious conversation about Neolithic monument building. The pyramids offer another kind of comparison. Egypt's Great Pyramid was built much later, in a society with kingship, administration, writing, large-scale labour organisation, and a very different landscape. The pyramids are extraordinary, but they belong to the age of a state. Newgrange does not. It belongs to farming communities who left no royal names carved into stone. There is no known pharaoh of Newgrange, no official portrait of a ruler wearing a crown and looking firmly into eternity. That makes the achievement feel different. The Great Pyramid announces power with almost mathematical confidence. Newgrange speaks in a lower voice. It is not less impressive, but its impressiveness comes from another direction. It suggests coordination without written bureaucracy, shared belief without inscriptions, and technical skill without metal machinery. It shows us a society capable of long planning, not because a king demanded a monument to himself, but because something in that landscape, in that community, and in that relationship between the living, the dead, and the sun made the work meaningful. That is easy to say and hard to picture. Modern people often underestimate what can be done with time, skill, and coordinated effort. We are used to machines doing the heavy lifting, so when we see ancient stonework, we are tempted to jump too quickly to mystery. But mystery should not be used as a shortcut around human ability. The Neolithic builders did not need alien engineers, lost batteries, or helpful wizards with an interest in megalithic architecture. They needed observation, planning, labour, and social commitment. Those are ordinary human things, but in the right combination, over enough time, they become extraordinary. Imagine the work not as a single dramatic event, but as repeated days. people selecting stones, people cutting turf, people dragging, rolling, levering, adjusting, someone checking an angle, someone arguing about whether a stone is properly placed, someone bringing food, someone watching children near the work area and wishing everyone would stop leaving tools where small hands could find them. The building of Newgrange would have been physical, social, noisy at times, perhaps ceremonial at others. It may have brought together people from a wider region. It may have required feasting, exchange, leadership, obligation and trust. It was not just architecture, it was a community acting over time. The surrounding Boyne Valley matters here because Newgrange is not alone. It stands within a rich ceremonial landscape known as Bruna Boyne, where other great passage tombs, including Noth and Douth, form part of a larger prehistoric complex. This was not a random mound placed in a random field, because someone had spare energy after milking the cattle. The valley was chosen, used, revisited, and marked again and again. Its monuments speak to one another across the land. The river bends nearby, and rivers in ancient worlds were not simply scenery. They were roots, boundaries, sources of food, markers of place, and perhaps sacred presences. The Boyne itself later became woven into Irish myth and story. But even before those tales were written down, the valley had already become important enough for some of the most ambitious construction in prehistoric Europe. There is a temptation to imagine the builders as isolated villagers looking only at the hill in front of them. But Newgrange suggests broader connections. Certain stones and materials appear to have come from places beyond the immediate mound. The white quartz associated with the monument, the darker stones, the great slabs used in construction, all point to choices that involved moving materials and understanding where particular kinds of stone could be found. Whether by land, river, sea, or some combination of routes, the builders were not trapped in one tiny circle of knowledge. They knew a landscape larger than the monument. They selected materials with care, and the finished mound likely looked striking even in its original form, though exactly how it looked is still debated. What matters for our purposes is that Newgrange was made to be seen, approached, and entered with intention. Older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, yes, but also older than so many things we take for granted as signs of civilization. Older than the alphabets that would later carry law, poetry, shopping lists, love letters, and complaints about taxes. Older than iron tools, older than classical temples, older than the Roman roads that still slice through parts of Europe in the imagination. Newgrange sits deep in a time when knowledge was carried in bodies and memories. If you needed to know when to plant, when animals might behave in a certain way, when the light would return, or where the sun would rise at a turning point in the year, that knowledge was not stored in a printed calendar. It lived in repeated observation, in teaching, in ritual, and perhaps in structures like this one. That makes the age of Newgrange feel less like a statistic and more like a form of continuity. The monument is old because it has survived, but it also survives because people kept paying attention to it, even when its meaning changed. Later generations did not necessarily understand it as its builders had. Some may have seen it as a fairy mound, a place of otherworldly presence, a feature of local story rather than archaeological record. That too is part of its life. Monuments do not remain meaningful in one way forever. They are reinterpreted by each age that encounters them. Newgrange has been a tomb, a sacred place, a mythic place, a curiosity, an archaeological site, a national treasure, and a destination for people who stand in a cold dawn hoping for a line of light. Its age is not just the distance from its construction. It is the accumulation of all the meanings that have gathered around it since. Still, the first builders are the ones who deserve our closest attention. They lived in a climate and landscape that demanded practical intelligence. Farming in Neolithic Ireland was not a casual hobby. It required seasonal timing, knowledge of soil, care for animals, and planning for winter. The same people who built monuments also had to live. They had to eat, repair, make, carry, store, and manage the ordinary difficulties of being human without central heating or online grocery delivery. It is worth remembering this because ancient monuments can trick us into imagining ancient people only in ceremonial moments, as though they spent their lives solemnly processing between stones. In reality, they also had mud, smoke, illness, hunger, jokes, arguments, and probably at least one person who always claimed to know a better way to stack something. The presence of such a massive monument within that world suggests that the practical and the ceremonial were not separate in the way we might separate them. The movement of the sun was not astronomy, as a detached science on one side and religion on the other. The dead were not simply disposed of and forgotten. The seasons were not background decoration. Everything was connected through the lived reality of the community. The return of the sun after the darkest part of the year could matter for farming, for ritual, for ancestors, for hope, and for the structure of time itself. Newgrange may have gathered these meanings together not by explaining them, but by giving them a place to happen. When we look at the mound today, it is difficult not to think in terms of time. 5,000 years is long enough for languages to appear and vanish, forests to grow and be cleared, kingdoms to rise and fall, beliefs to change, roads to be laid, wars to pass, and names to be lost. The builders of Newgrange are anonymous to us. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know the names of the people whose remains were placed there. That anonymity could feel like distance, but there is another way to see it. Their names are gone, yet their work remains. Their speech is gone, but their alignment with the sun still functions. Their daily lives are beyond our reach, but their attention survives in architecture. That is one of the reasons Newgrange feels so strangely intimate despite its scale. The builders are not present as individuals, but their decisions are present. The angle of the passage is a decision. The placement of the roof box is a decision. The selection of stones is a decision. The effort to build large and lasting is a decision. Every part of the monument is evidence that someone cared enough to make it that way. And when the winter sun enters, it is not merely light entering stone. It is a 5,000-year-old decision still producing its intended effect. Few human actions endure so clearly. Our own buildings often seem permanent when we stand beside them. Offices, apartment blocks, bridges, museums, stations, they feel solid enough. But many will be replaced, altered, demolished, or forgotten within a few generations. Newgrange has outlasted nearly every kind of structure that came after it. It has outlasted empires and borders it never knew existed. It has outlasted technologies that would have seemed unimaginable to its builders and fashions that even we would rather not discuss in detail. It has done this not as a towering object of polished imperial ambition, but as a mound in a valley, wrapped in earth, holding a dark passage aligned to winter light. There is a humility in that kind of endurance. Newgrange does not rise high like a pyramid. It does not point upward in the same obvious way. It sits low and broad, almost part of the land, yet clearly shaped by human hands. It does not dominate the horizon so much as thicken it. You approach it and sense that the important thing may not be its height, but its interior. Its secret is not only how it appears from outside, but what happens inside when the sun reaches the right place. That is quite different from monuments that impress primarily through sheer visibility. Newgrange makes you pay attention to timing, direction, and entrance. It is less a shout than a held breath, and perhaps that is why the comparison with later monuments should eventually soften. Older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, those phrases help us wake up to the scale of the achievement. But after they have done their work, we can set them down. Newgrange does not need to borrow wonder from anything else. It has its own. It belongs to its own landscape, its own society, its own pattern of stone and sun. It is not remarkable only because it predates other famous places. It is remarkable because it shows us how early human beings were already building with time in mind. That idea is worth carrying forward carefully. Building with time in mind is different from building in time. Every structure takes time to make, of course. A shed takes time. A wall takes time. A surprisingly complicated flat-pack bookshelf takes time, and may also take a small offering of patience. But Newgrange was built to interact with time. It was designed so that a yearly event would reveal itself inside the monument. That means its builders were not simply making a place. They were making a relationship between place and season. They were turning observation into architecture. To do that, they had to know the sun not as a symbol only, but as a repeatable presence in the sky. They had to understand that the winter sunrise reached a limit and then returned along its path. They had to recognize a pattern stable enough to build around. This is not quite a clock, not in the modern sense. It does not count seconds or divide the day into neat units. It is more like a stone agreement with the year. The sun will come here. The light will enter there. Darkness will not have the final word. The people who made Newgrange may not have phrased it that way, and we should not pretend we know their exact thoughts. But the structure itself tells us that the winter turning point was made visible and meaningful. So when we say Newgrange is older than Stonehenge and older than the pyramids, we are not merely placing it on a timeline. We are allowing it to disturb a lazy idea of the past. The Neolithic was not a waiting room before history. It was a world of skilled farmers, builders, observers, artists, and communities who could create places of astonishing durability and purpose. They did not leave us written explanations. They left us something slower, a mound, a passage, a chamber, a roof box, carved stones, human remains, a yearly sunrise. And from those things, carefully studied and carefully imagined, we begin to understand that the builders of Newgrange were not at the edge of civilization. They were fully inside the human habit of making meaning, using the tools and knowledge their world had given them. The next step is to move closer to those people, not as anonymous hands moving stone in the distance, but as a living community with a practical world around them. Because a monument does not begin with the first stone being placed. It begins earlier, with the people who decide that such a place should exist at all, with the fields they worked, the animals they tended, the dead they remembered, and the winter mornings they watched closely enough to turn sunlight into an appointment. To understand Newgrange properly, we have to spend some time with the people who made it. Not as shadows in the background, not as a vague crowd of ancient builders moving stones around because history required someone to do it, but as real human beings living in a real landscape. They did not see themselves as prehistoric. No one does. They were not walking around thinking we are currently in the Neolithic period, which will be very useful for future museum labels. They were simply alive, working with the materials and knowledge available to them, raising children, managing animals, dealing with weather, illness, hunger, arguments, celebrations, and all the ordinary complications of belonging to a community. Newgrange was made by people who had to get through winter before they could think about the symbolism of winter. That's important, because the monument was not built in a world of spare time and easy comfort. It came out of a society where survival and meaning were closely tied together. These were farming people, living thousands of years after agriculture had begun to spread across Europe and several centuries after farming had become part of life in Ireland. They grew crops such as wheat and barley, kept cattle, sheep, goats and pigs, and shaped their days around work that depended on season and weather. The land around the Boyne was not just scenery, it was food, shelter, root, memory and obligation. Fields had to be cleared, planted, watched and harvested. Animals had to be moved, fed, protected and sometimes slaughtered. Tools had to be made and repaired. Houses had to stand against rain and wind. Wood had to be gathered. Food had to be stored carefully enough to last. A bad season was not an inconvenience. It could change everything. So when these people looked at the sun, they were not looking only as dreamers or early astronomers. They were looking as farmers, herders, parents, mourners, and people who needed the year to keep its promises. It is easy from a modern distance to imagine their lives as either brutally simple or romantically peaceful. Neither picture is very useful. A Neolithic settlement was not a soft focus painting of everyone smiling beside a basket of grain, but it was also not a dull struggle without thought or beauty. People made pottery, shaped stone axes, worked wood, cooked meals, told stories, made decisions, cared for the dead, and probably complained about the weather with an accuracy and commitment that would feel very familiar to anyone who has spent time in Ireland. Their homes were likely built from timber, wattle, daub, thatch, and other organic materials that rarely survive as dramatically as stone. This is one reason the dead sometimes seem more visible than the living in archaeology. Stone tombs remain. Wooden houses decay. The monuments stay behind, looking solemn and permanent, while the places where people laughed, slept, cooked, and lost small household objects gradually fade into the soil. That imbalance can trick the imagination. We stand before Newgrange and see a great mound for the dead, and the living become harder to picture. But the monument was surrounded in its own time by living communities. People came from households, from kin groups, perhaps from settlements scattered across the wider region. They brought food, tools, labour and knowledge. They carried stones, but they also carried stories about who they were and who had come before them. A place like Newgrange does not appear because one practical task needs doing. It appears because a community agrees, in some form, that the task matters more than ordinary effort can explain. It needed builders, yes, but before that it needed belief, memory, organisation, and a shared sense that the dead, the land, and the winter sun belonged together in a way that deserved a permanent place. The phrase, house for winterlight, is not a technical term, but it helps us approach the monument gently. Newgrange was not a house for ordinary living. Nobody was sleeping comfortably in the inner chamber with a blanket, a cup of something warm, and a firm opinion about the draught. It was a passage tomb, a chambered monument where human remains were placed, and its interior had a different purpose from a domestic home. Yet in another sense, the builders did make a kind of house. They made a structure that received, held, and framed a visitor that came only at a certain time, the low rising sun around the winter solstice. They built walls of stone and a roof above darkness. They made an entrance that admitted people, and above it a narrow opening that admitted light. The chamber became a place where the living could enter, where the dead were remembered, and where sunlight itself could arrive as if expected. That expectation is the key. The winter solstice illumination at Newgrange was not a lucky accident caused by a careless gap in the masonry. It required planning. The passage had to be oriented toward the correct part of the horizon. The opening above the entrance, often called the roof box, had to be made so the low winter sunrise could travel inward. The passage had to maintain that line into the chamber, and because the sun's path changes slowly across the year, the effect would be limited to a small number of mornings around the solstice. A monument like this shows that its builders were not merely aware of sunrise in a general way. They understood that different sunrises belonged to different parts of the year, and they built around one of them. This does not mean they were scientists in the modern sense, with notebooks, instruments, and one person insisting that the data must be peer-reviewed before anyone moves another boulder. But careful observation does not require modern science. It requires attention over time. Someone had to watch the horizon. Someone had to notice the southernmost rising point of the sun in winter. Someone had to recognize that this point was not random, that it marked a turning. The sun did not keep slipping farther away forever. It reached a limit and then began to return. If you live in a world without electric lights, that observation is not a charming seasonal fact. It is a reassurance built into the sky. How was that knowledge gathered? Slowly, probably. The sky rewards patience more than cleverness. You can learn a great deal by watching from the same place over years. A person might mark where the sun rises at different times, using stones, posts, trees, ridges, or remembered lines in the landscape. Families and communities might pass that knowledge down. The horizon becomes a calendar, not because someone labels it, but because repeated experience teaches the eyes. That is where the sun rises in summer. That is where it rises when the nights lengthen. That is the place it reaches before the light begins to come back. Over enough seasons, the sky becomes familiar in the same way a path through fields becomes familiar. You know it because you have walked it with your attention. The people who built Newgrange probably did not separate practical knowledge from ritual knowledge as neatly as we often do. For them, the movement of the sun could be useful, sacred, ancestral and communal all at once. The winter turning point may have helped mark seasonal change, but it may also have carried meaning about renewal, death, rebirth, or the relationship between the living and those whose remains were placed inside. We should be cautious with words like rebirth, because they can make ancient belief sound more certain to us than it really is. Archaeologists can identify patterns, structures, materials, and remains. They cannot interview the builders about their theology over a quiet breakfast. Still, the arrangement of Newgrange invites us to say that the winter sun mattered. A beam of light entering a chamber associated with the dead at the darkest point of the year is not a neutral architectural feature. It is a statement, even if we cannot translate every word of it, and the dead were certainly part of that statement. Human remains found at Newgrange show that it was connected with burial practices, though the exact rituals remain uncertain. In many Neolithic passage tombs, the dead were not always buried as complete bodies in the way many people might picture from later graves. Cremated remains, selected bones, and collective deposits point to ways of treating the dead that focused less on individual burial plots and more on ancestry, community, and continuing presence. The chamber may have held remains of people whose identities mattered deeply to those who returned there. Ancestors, in such a world, were not simply gone. They may have remained part of the social and spiritual landscape, tied to land, memory, and seasonal ceremony. If that was so, then Newgrange was not only a place where people put the dead, it was a place where the living could encounter them, remember them, include them, or seek connection with them. The inner chamber, dark for most of the year, would have been a powerful setting. Imagine entering by a narrow passage, leaving daylight behind, moving into a carefully built stone space where sounds change, air cools, and the outside world seems to withdraw. Even today, with guides, safety rules, and modern expectations, passage tomb interiors can feel unusually still. For Neolithic people, the experience may have been far more charged. Stone, darkness, bone, and memory were not museum elements. They were part of a living relationship. Then consider what happens when winter sunlight enters that space. The chamber is not lit like a room with a window. It is touched briefly, specifically, and seasonally. The light comes at the time when the year is darkest. If people gathered inside or near the monument to witness it, the event must have had force. The sun did not merely rise outside, it reached into the monument, it crossed the threshold between open sky and enclosed stone. It entered the place of the dead. Whatever interpretation we choose, we must allow the event to be physical first. A cold morning, waiting. Breath visible in the air, the first brightness on the horizon. Then a line of sunlight moving into a passage built by human hands. The body would understand that before the mind decorated it with meaning. The builders had to create more than an alignment. They had to create a stable interior. The passage and chamber were made of large stones arranged with great care. The roof of the chamber uses corbelling, with stones placed so each layer steps inward until the space closes overhead. It is an ancient method, but not a crude one. A corbelled roof must be carefully balanced. The stones must bear weight. Water must be managed. The mound around and above the chamber must not simply crush the structure. That Newgrange survived for thousands of years tells us something about the builders' practical skill. They knew how to make stone behave. And stone, like a stubborn donkey or a badly folded map, does not behave just because one hopes it will. The construction would also have required organisation beyond the household level. A single family could not casually build Newgrange in its spare moments between chores. The monument scale suggests coordinated labour, perhaps seasonal gatherings, perhaps leadership roles, perhaps obligations tied to kinship, belief, or alliance. People had to be fed while they worked. Tasks had to be divided. Heavy stones had to be moved safely enough that the project could continue. Some individuals may have specialised in certain skills, such as selecting stones, carving designs, arranging structural elements, or tracking the solar alignment. Others may have contributed labour as part of a broader community responsibility. We do not need to imagine a modern workforce. We can imagine something more embedded. Families, lineages, neighbours, ritual specialists, skilled builders, and people whose names are gone but whose cooperation remains visible. Food may have been central to that cooperation. Large projects often bring people together not only through labour, but through feasting. Archaeologists studying Neolithic sites across Britain and Ireland have often emphasised the importance of gatherings where animals were slaughtered, food was shared, and social relationships were reinforced. At Newgrange and in the wider Boyne Valley, it is reasonable to think that building and ceremony involved meals, meetings, and social exchange. The work of raising a monument can strengthen a community by giving people something shared to do. Of course, anyone who has ever organised a group activity knows that shared work can also produce disagreement, delay, and one person who has brought entirely the wrong tools. But that too is community. Newgrange is evidence not of perfect harmony, but of enough cooperation to make a difficult plan succeed. The stones themselves connect the builders to a wider geography. Some material used at Newgrange came from beyond the immediate site, suggesting movement across land and perhaps by water. The River Boyne would have mattered in practical ways, as rivers often did. It could carry people, materials, stories, and contact. The valley was not a sealed container. The builders lived in networks of exchange and knowledge. They may have known other communities, other monuments, other traditions of tomb building and stone carving. Newgrange belongs to a broader passage tomb tradition, but it is also distinct in its solstice design. That combination is typical of human culture: shared patterns, local choices. One of the most vivid traces of those choices is the art carved into the stones. Spirals, arcs, lozenges, circles, and other geometric forms appear on curbstones and interior stones. The entrance stone at Newgrange is especially famous, with its large triple spiral and flowing designs. These carvings are often reproduced today on postcards, jewellery, books, mugs, and the sort of gift shop objects that prove no ancient symbol can fully escape being placed on a fridge magnet. But before they became decorative motifs for modern visitors, they were marks made with effort on stone. Carving hard surfaces with stone tools takes patience. It is not doodling in the margin of a notebook. Each line represents time, pressure, and intention. What did the carvings mean? We do not know with certainty. They may have related to the sun, the movement of the year, the landscape, the dead, states of mind, clan symbols, myths, or concepts we no longer have access to. Some may have been made before the stones were placed. Some may have been positioned so they were hidden or partly hidden after construction. That detail matters. Art was not always made for easy public viewing. Some designs may have been intended for the monument itself for ritual use, for restricted viewing, or for meanings not based on display. Modern people often assume that if something is decorated, it must be meant to be seen by everyone. Newgrange suggests a more complicated relationship. Some things may have been made meaningful by being concealed. A house for winterlight, then, was also a house for stone signs, remembered dead, careful engineering, and shared labour. Its builders lived in a world where the line between natural and human-made was not drawn as sharply as we draw it. The mound itself imitates and alters the land. It is both hill and building. Its stones come from the earth, but are arranged by hands. Its chamber is hidden like a cave, but constructed with intention. The sun is natural, yet its light is guided by architecture. Newgrange sits exactly in that meeting place between what the world does and what people make of it. This may be why the monument still feels powerful without needing us to fully explain it. We recognise the human impulse behind it. We too build around what we fear losing. We build cemeteries, memorials, churches, observatories, museums, family homes, and calendars. We create rituals around darkness and light, endings and returns, anniversaries and beginnings. We may not build great stone mounds for the winter sunrise, mostly because planning permission would be a challenge and the neighbours might have questions, but the underlying impulse is not alien. We still want to place ourselves within time. We still want to believe that dark seasons turn. We still want the dead to remain part of our story. The people who built Newgrange did that with the tools of their world. They did not use writing, but they made a monument that records attention. They did not use metal, but they shaped stone into a structure that endures. They did not have our astronomy, but they tracked the sun closely enough to create one of the most famous solar alignments in ancient Europe. Their achievement asks us to rethink what knowledge looks like. Knowledge is not only equations and documents. Sometimes it is a passage facing the right sunrise. Sometimes it is a roof box placed at the correct height. Sometimes it is a community returning year after year to confirm that the light still comes. And there is something quietly moving about imagining the first time the finished monument worked. After all the planning, hauling, building, carving, sealing and waiting, there must have been a morning when the rising sun entered as intended. Perhaps the builders had tested the line before the mound was complete. Perhaps they already knew. But even so, the completed effect would have mattered. People gathered in the cold, the chamber dark, the passage ready, the horizon brightening. Then sunlight arriving through the roof box and moving inward, turning the unseen calculations of the builders into visible gold. It is hard to imagine that moment passing without silence, or awe, or at least the Neolithic equivalent of someone whispering, "Well, that worked." From our distance, we cannot recover their words. We cannot know who stood there, who was allowed inside, who waited outside, who led the ceremony, who carried memories of the dead, or who felt relief as the sun returned. But we can say that the people who built Newgrange made something that joined human effort to a precise moment in the year. They built not only for the present, but for repetition. The monument was designed to happen again. That's a remarkable thing. It means the builders imagined future mornings, future gatherings, future people standing where they stood. They built continuity into stone. In that sense, Newgrange is not just old because it comes from the distant past. It is old because it was made to face the future. Every winter solstice sunrise it receives is a future the builders never saw, and yet somehow prepared for. We are among those future people. We arrive with different clothes, languages, beliefs and devices in our pockets that would seem more magical than anything carved on the stones. But the basic scene remains understandable. Darkness, waiting, the low winter sun, a passage, a chamber, light entering where people long ago meant it to enter. With that in mind, we can move closer to the structure itself and begin to follow the stones inward, where the design becomes narrower, darker, and more deliberate with every step. Moving toward the entrance of Newgrange changes the way the monument feels. From a distance, it's a mound in a field, large and old and calmly impressive, with the green of the grass and the pale front of stone catching the eye. But when you come closer, the shape stops being only a shape. It becomes a threshold. The great curve of the mound begins to block out part of the sky. The stones become individual stones, not just a ring or a wall, but surfaces with weight, texture, marks, edges, and the quiet stubbornness that stone has when it has stayed somewhere for a very long time. The entrance is not a wide, inviting doorway in the ordinary sense. It is narrow, controlled, deliberate. It does not say, come in casually, have a look around, see what you think. It says, enter carefully. This is not the kind of place designed for wandering in with muddy boots and half a sandwich. At the front lies one of the most famous stones in prehistoric Europe, the large decorated curbstone placed before the entrance. Its surface is carved with spirals, arcs, diamond shapes, and flowing lines that seem at first to move more easily than stone should. The designs are not pictures in the simple sense. They do not show a person holding a tool, or a cow, or a neat little diagram of the sun with helpful labels around it. They are geometric, repeated, balanced, and strange. They look made by minds that cared about pattern, rhythm, direction, and perhaps ideas that cannot be translated into modern words. The large triple spiral on the entrance stone has become especially well known, partly because it is visually memorable, and partly because human beings are very good at turning ancient mystery into a logo. Still, before it belonged to books, posters, visitor guides, and the occasional tasteful pendant, it belonged to this stone, this entrance, and this passage into darkness. That entrance stone is not just decoration placed conveniently for modern admiration. It stands at the boundary between the outside world and the interior. To approach Newgrange is to encounter the art before entering the tomb. This matters because the passage is not merely a corridor. It is a carefully staged movement from light into dark, from open air into enclosure, from the everyday landscape into a chamber built deep within the mound. The carved stone at the entrance slows the approach. It gives the eyes something to read, even if we no longer know the language. And perhaps that is part of the point. Not all reading is done with words. Sometimes a surface tells you that you are crossing from one kind of space into another. Above the entrance is the feature that makes Newgrange especially famous, the roof box. It is a small opening, almost easy to underestimate if you're expecting drama to arrive in a more theatrical costume. It sits above the main doorway, and it is through this opening, not through the ordinary entrance below, that the winter solstice sunlight enters the monument. That detail is quietly brilliant. The builders did not simply point a passage toward the sunrise and leave the doorway open, hoping for the best. They made a separate opening positioned to catch the low light of the midwinter dawn. This means the beam can pass over the entrance and travel along the passage toward the chamber. In practical terms, it is a small architectural feature. In meaning, it is enormous. It turns the building into a device for admitting a particular sunrise. The passage itself runs inward for about 19 metres, a long enough distance that the outside world cannot follow easily. As you move through it, the mound surrounds you. The sky disappears, the walls draw close. Large upright stones known as orthostats form the sides, and they are not smooth, regular blocks in the modern building sense. They are megalithic slabs, each with its own shape and surface. Some lean, some press, some seem almost to shoulder their way into the narrow space. The passage is not perfectly uniform, and that lack of machine-like regularity is part of its power. It feels made, but not manufactured. Not. Human hands arranged it, yet the stones retain their own character, as if each one agreed to become part of the structure without giving up being itself. Walking such a passage would have been a bodily experience before it was an intellectual one. The space narrows attention. Footsteps change sound. Voices become softer, or sometimes strangely enlarged by the stone. The air feels still. The further inward you go, the less the outside matters. This is not like entering a modern museum room where signs, lights, alarms, and polished floors keep reminding you of the present. The passage was built to reduce the world. Field, river, settlement, weather, animals, and ordinary daylight are left behind. The body becomes aware of height, width, breadth, stone, and the distance back to the entrance. It is not difficult to understand why a community would use such a place for serious things. The architecture itself asks for seriousness, though perhaps in a very calm voice. Some of the passage stones are carved, and some carvings are hidden, or partly hidden by their placement. This is one of the more interesting things about megalithic art at Newgrange. Modern visitors often assume decoration is meant to be displayed, because that is how we usually treat decoration. We put pictures where people can see them. We light them, frame them, and sometimes stand nearby pretending to understand them more deeply than we do. But at Newgrange, some designs were placed where they were not easily visible after construction. This suggests that visibility to ordinary viewers was not always the main purpose. The act of carving may have mattered. The stone's role within the monument may have mattered. The design may have been intended for restricted moments, for ritual knowledge, or for the monument itself, if we may put it that way without making the stone sound too opinionated. The passage leads into a central chamber with 3 side recesses, often described as forming a roughly cross-shaped or cruciform arrangement. That word can mislead a little, because it may make the mind jump to much later religious imagery, which is not what we need here. It simply means that the main chamber has recesses opening from it, giving the interior a structured shape rather than a simple room at the end of a tunnel. Within these recesses are basin stones, large stone settings associated with the remains of the dead. The chamber was not empty space. It had focus, function, and arrangement. It was a place where human remains, ritual activity, stone art, and the solstice light all belonged to the same interior world. Above the chamber is one of the most impressive parts of the construction, the corbelled roof. Instead of using a single flat slab across the top, the builders placed courses of stones, so that each level projects slightly inward over the one below, gradually narrowing the opening until the roof closes. It is a method found in other ancient structures, but that does not make it any less clever. Corbelling requires an understanding of weight, balance, and pressure. If the stones are placed poorly, the roof fails. If water is not managed, the chamber suffers. Newgrange's chamber has remained standing across thousands of years, which is a fairly strong review of the builder's work, and one that any modern contractor would probably enjoy putting on a business card. There is a quiet satisfaction in the engineering. The roof does not need mortar in the modern sense. It does not rely on concrete, steel, or helpful computer modelling. It relies on careful placement, accumulated knowledge, and stone doing what stone can do when treated with respect. The builders understood that a mound is not simply a pile. A pile collapses, shifts, leaks, and sulks. A mound containing a chamber has to be controlled. Weight must move through the structure in ways the chamber can survive. The passage must not buckle. The roof must shed pressure. The whole monument has to hold itself together through rain, frost, settlement, and the slow, grinding patience of centuries. Newgrange did this so successfully that we can still enter its inner space today. Not exactly as Neolithic people did, because modern conservation and visitor management now shape the experience, but close enough to feel the intention of the architecture. Inside, geometry becomes less like a school subject and more like a lived arrangement. We often think of geometry as something involving diagrams, rulers, formulas, and the faint smell of classroom dust. But geometry began as a way of understanding space, and Newgrange is full of spatial decisions. The passage is aligned. The chamber is positioned. The roof rises. The recesses balance the interior. The roof box admits light at a certain angle. The curbstones define the boundary of the mound. Circular form, linear passage, angled sunlight, carved spirals, and chambered enclosure all come together. This is not geometry written on a board. It is geometry you can walk through. The word sacred can be difficult because it asks us to step carefully. We do not know exactly what the builders believed. We cannot take our own religious categories and place them neatly over a Neolithic monument, as if the past were waiting to be filed correctly. But we can say that Newgrange was not ordinary architecture. Its scale, its treatment of the dead, its decoration, and its alignment with the winter sunrise all point to a place set apart. Sacred geometry in this context does not need to mean secret mathematical codes or mystical diagrams hidden for future puzzle enthusiasts. It can mean something simpler and more grounded. The use of form, direction, proportion, and pattern to create a meaningful encounter between people, stone, darkness, and the sun. The spirals are part of that. A spiral is a simple form, yet it refuses to sit still in the mind. It turns inward and outward at the same time. It can suggest movement, growth, return, or cycles, though we must be careful not to decide too confidently what it meant to the builders. Spirals appear widely in megalithic art, including in the Boyne Valley, and they may have carried meanings connected with time, light, ancestry, or cosmology. Or they may have meant something more specific to the people who carved them, something we can feel as patterned intention but not fully translate. The important point is that they were not random scratches. They were made deliberately, with repeated effort, on stones placed in a monument where direction and timing mattered greatly. There is a temptation, whenever ancient geometry appears, to rush toward hidden messages. People love the idea that every measurement contains a secret, every angle a code, every spiral a complete calendar tucked away for the patient modern investigator. Sometimes this enthusiasm produces interesting theories, and sometimes it produces the academic equivalent of seeing a familiar face in a burnt piece of toast. Newgrange does not need every line to be decoded to be meaningful. Its strongest geometry is already visible in its design. The passage points toward the winter solstice sunrise. The roof box lets the light enter. The interior receives that light. This is enough to show careful knowledge. The monument's power does not depend on turning every carving into a solved equation. Still, the carvings do invite long looking. In a sleepier mood, one might imagine the hand that carved them. A person kneeling or sitting by stone, using a harder stone tool to peck or incise the surface. The work would have been slow, repeated strikes, adjustments, dust, perhaps conversations nearby, perhaps silence. The person making the marks may have known exactly what each curve meant, or may have been following a tradition older than themselves. They may have learned from someone else. They may have taught another hand in turn. The carved lines are fixed now, but the act of making them was movement, sound, pressure, and time. That is easy to forget when we see ancient art behind barriers or in photographs. The finished pattern looks calm. The making of it was work. Light inside the monument would have behaved differently depending on circumstance. Ordinary entry with lamps or torches would create moving shadows, uneven illumination, and flickers across stone surfaces. Firelight makes carving seem almost active. Lines appear, vanish, and reappear as the flame shifts. The passage and chamber may have been experienced not as uniformly visible spaces, but as places where sight came in fragments. One moment a carved spiral might catch the light, another moment a basin stone, another the roof rising into darkness. In such conditions, geometry would not be only seen, it would be revealed gradually. Modern electric lighting, useful as it is, can sometimes flatten mystery by showing everything at once. Firelight edits. It makes the eye wait. Then there is the solstice sunlight, which is different from flame. It enters from outside, from the horizon, through a built opening, at a specific time of year. It does not flicker like a torch. It advances. It travels along the passage with a kind of slow confidence, widening as the sun rises, touching surfaces that normally remain dark. The beam is not a symbol added to the monument later by storytellers. It is a physical event produced by alignment. The sunlight has to obey the position of Earth, the season, the horizon, and the architecture. It is both ordinary and astonishing, which is often the best kind of wonder. Sunlight is familiar. Sunlight inside a 5,000-year-old chamber at the darkest point of the year is not. Imagine standing in the chamber before dawn. The darkness would not be an absence in the casual sense. It would be a material part of the experience. The passage behind you leads back to the outside, but until light enters, the chamber is enclosed in shadow. Then, if the sky is clear enough, the first beam appears. It does not flood the chamber instantly. It begins as a narrow arrival. The stone surfaces catch it. The interior changes. Details that were hidden become visible. The chamber, which seemed sealed from the world, is connected suddenly to the sunrise. The people who designed this knew that the effect depended on contrast. Without darkness, the light would mean less. Newgrange does not merely admit sunlight, it prepares darkness for it. That may be one of the most important things about the interior. The passage is long enough, narrow enough, and enclosed enough to make darkness real. If the chamber were bright all year, the solstice would be just another morning. If the doorway were broad, light would enter too easily. If the passage were misaligned, the winter sun would miss its appointment. Everything depends on restraint. The monument controls access, light, movement, and timing. It is not generous with visibility, and that is precisely why the brief illumination matters. Scarcity gives the event weight. The chamber wakes because it has spent most of the year asleep. The stones of the passage may also have shaped movement socially. Not everyone may have been allowed inside. The interior is not large, and that practical fact alone means access was limited. It is possible that only certain people entered during ceremonies, while others gathered outside. Perhaps the chamber was a restricted place for ritual specialists, elders, or members of particular families. Perhaps access changed depending on occasion. We do not know, but the size of the passage and chamber makes one thing clear. Newgrange was not designed for a crowd to stroll through the interior at once. It creates an intimate experience, even inside a massive mound. The monument is large, but its central event happens in a small, controlled space. This contrast between the outside and inside is striking. Outside, the mound is broad and public. It can be seen in the landscape. It presents a face of stone and earth. Inside, the passage narrows and the chamber gathers meaning into a small area. Large effort creates small focus. That is true of many ceremonial spaces, ancient and modern. A whole cathedral may direct the eye toward an altar. A stadium may focus attention on a small field of play. A house may gather family life around a kitchen table. Newgrange gathers a monumental mound around a dark chamber and a line of winter light. The scale outside serves the concentration inside. There are also details in the chamber that remind us of the dead. The basin stones, the remains found, and the structure of the recesses point toward funerary use. But the interior does not feel like a simple storage place for bones. It feels arranged for encounter. The dead were placed within a space that the living could enter and that sunlight could reach. This does not mean we can reconstruct the ceremony, but it does mean the dead were not hidden in a meaningless hole. They were placed within architecture. Their presence was part of a built relationship between ancestors, community, stone, and season. The winter sun entering the chamber may have connected the return of light with those who'd gone before. It may have renewed the bond between the living and the dead, or it may have expressed something even more complex, something that made complete sense in Neolithic thought, and now reaches us only as an outline. The geometry of Newgrange, then, is not cold. It is not a technical trick performed for accuracy alone. It is lived geometry, ceremonial geometry, practical geometry, and perhaps ancestral geometry. The passage is a line, but it is also a route. The mound is a circle, but it is also a boundary. The roof box is an opening, but it is also a seasonal gate. The spiral is a pattern, but it may also be a way of thinking about movement and return. These forms do not sit separately in the monument. They reinforce one another. To enter Newgrange is to move through a built sequence: decorated threshold, narrow passage, dark chamber, rising roof, side recesses, and, at the right time, sunlight. What makes the interior even more compelling is that it asks for trust in the builders. When you enter a passage tomb, you enter a space made by people from a world you cannot fully know. You trust their stones to hold. You trust their design to guide you. You trust that the darkness has meaning, not merely emptiness. And in the case of Newgrange, the solstice alignment proves that their understanding of the sky was not approximate in the lazy sense. It was good enough to build into architecture. Their geometry worked. It still works. That is a rare kind of communication across time. No words, no names, no explanation, but a functioning relationship between a built passage and a yearly sunrise. modern visitors often experience a simulation of the solstice light inside Newgrange, because not everyone can be there on the few mornings when the real event occurs, and because the weather may decide to hide the sun with the casual authority of a grey Irish cloud. The simulation helps people understand the effect, and it can be moving in its own way. But the original event depends on the actual sky. That matters. Newgrange was not built for artificial light, although artificial light can teach us about it. It was built for the low winter sun itself, for a moving world and a moving year. The monument's geometry is tied to Earth's orbit and tilt, to the horizon, to the local landscape, and to the patient recurrence of midwinter dawn. As we sit with the passage in the mind, it becomes clear that the interior of Newgrange is not merely the inside of a mound. It is the part of the monument where all its ideas meet. The outer mound gives mass and presence. The curbstones define the edge. The entrance stone marks the threshold. The roof box admits the sun. The passage controls movement. The chamber holds the dead and receives the light. The carvings add pattern and perhaps memory. The roof encloses everything with a lasting skill that has outlived the language of its builders. Nothing here feels accidental. Even the uncertainties feel structured. And yet, we should not make Newgrange too neat. It was not a diagram built from stone. It was a place used by people. Over time, ceremonies may have changed. Meanings may have shifted. Different generations may have understood the carvings or the solstice light in different ways. A monument that lasts long enough gathers more than one interpretation, even among the people who inherit it. The first builders may have had one intention. Their grandchildren may have added another. Later communities may have remembered, misunderstood, transformed, or renewed the place. Newgrange's interior, like any powerful space, may have held layers of meaning even in antiquity. That thought makes the passage feel less like a tunnel into a single answer, and more like a route into accumulated attention. Each stone was placed, each carving made, each ceremony, if ceremonies occurred there as the evidence suggests, added experience to the place. Each winter returned. Each time the sun reached the chamber, the monument confirmed that the pattern still held. For people living close to the uncertainty of season and survival, that confirmation must have mattered. It was not simply beautiful. It was reliable in the way the sky can be reliable, except when clouds interfere, which they do with a confidence bordering on artistry. From the outside, Newgrange is a mound older than many of the world's most famous monuments. From the inside, it becomes something more focused, a stone passage that narrows the body's movement, a chamber that gathers silence, and an architecture that waits for a particular angle of light. Its geometry is not hidden in a code. It is there in the experience of entering. Straight line into curved mound, low passage into rising chamber, darkness into sunrise, stone into pattern, human effort into seasonal recurrence. That is the design, and it is strong enough without exaggeration. As we leave the chamber in our minds for now, the passage behind us still holds its line to the horizon. The entrance stone remains at the threshold, carved with forms that continue to invite more looking than certainty. The roof box waits above the doorway, small and easily missed until one understands what it can do. And all around, the mound keeps its patient shape, holding the interior apart from ordinary daylight. The most famous morning has not arrived yet. For that, we need to stand with Newgrange at the darkest turn of the year, when the passage, the chamber, the stones and the sky all meet in the brief event that made this monument known across the world. The morning that makes Newgrange famous does not begin dramatically. It begins in the dark, which is exactly where it should begin. Long before the sun rises over the Boyne Valley, the monument is already waiting, as it has waited through thousands of winters. The grass on the mound is cold. The stones hold the night in their surfaces. The river moves somewhere nearby, not loudly, not as a grand announcement, but with that steady confidence rivers have, as if they know perfectly well where they're going and do not need advice from anyone. Around the monument the land is still, the kind of stillness that happens before dawn in winter, when even the birds seem to be considering whether the day is worth starting just yet. For most of the year, Newgrange is dark inside in the ordinary way ancient chambers are dark. The passage leads inward, the stones narrow around you, and the central chamber sits beyond the reach of direct daylight. Visitors today can see the interior with controlled lighting, and guides can recreate the solstice effect so people understand what happens, but the real event belongs to the sky. It depends on season, angle, sunrise, weather, and timing. It depends on Earth being exactly where it is in its yearly journey around the sun. It depends on the low winter light arriving at the correct part of the horizon and finding the small opening above the entrance. It depends, in the most practical Irish way possible, on the clouds not deciding to attend in large numbers. That uncertainty is part of the moment. The builders of Newgrange could align stone with the winter sunrise, but they could not command clear weather. Neither can we. Even today, with satellites, forecasts, live streams, and people standing around in excellent waterproof coats, the solstice morning remains partly beyond arrangement. A clear sky allows the beam to enter. A cloudy sky softens it, hides it, or turns the whole event into a patient act of faith. This may feel frustrating, but it also keeps the monument honest. Newgrange is not a machine that performs whenever humans ask. It is a meeting place between human design and the natural world. The design is precise, the weather is not. The result is a yearly drama with no guarantee, which is probably why it still feels alive. The winter solstice marks the shortest day and the longest night of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. It usually falls on the 21st or 22nd of December. Astronomically, it is the moment when the North Pole is tilted farthest from the Sun, giving the northern half of the planet its least daylight. That sounds very tidy when written in a science book, but the lived experience is simpler. The days have been getting shorter, the evenings have been arriving early, the mornings have been reluctant. Then comes this turning point. The sun reaches its lowest annual path and begins gradually to return. Not all at once, not with a trumpet fanfare and a sudden improvement in everyone's mood, though that would be helpful. The change is small at first, but real. After the solstice, the days begin to lengthen. For people living 5,000 years ago, that turning must have mattered deeply. Winter was not only a season for warm drinks, soft blankets, and the noble art of avoiding outdoor errands. It was a demanding time. Food stores had to last. Animals had to be kept alive. Cold and darkness shaped daily life. The sun's return was not a decorative symbol. It was a practical reassurance written in the sky. The year had reached its darkest edge and had not fallen over it. Light would come back. Warmth would come later. Growth would follow in its own time. The community that watched the sun carefully enough to build Newgrange was watching something that touched survival, memory, and meaning all at once. Now imagine that morning in the Neolithic world. We cannot know the exact ceremony, and we should not pretend otherwise. No account was written down. No voice from that time explains who gathered, what was said, who entered, who waited outside, or whether silence was kept as the sun rose. But the structure gives us the outline of an experience. Some people may have come before dawn, perhaps only a few were allowed into the chamber. The passage is narrow, and the chamber is not large, so the inner event could never have belonged to a crowd in the modern sense. Others may have stood outside near the entrance, around the mound, or elsewhere in the landscape. There may have been ritual actions, offerings, words, songs, food, or gestures toward the dead. Or perhaps at the critical moment there was simply waiting, which can be its own form of ceremony when everyone understands what is being waited for. The chamber before sunrise would have been dark enough to make the body alert. Darkness inside stone is different from darkness in a bedroom. A bedroom still belongs to daily life. You know where the door is, where the chair is, and exactly which object will find your toe if you walk carelessly. Inside Newgrange, darkness would have carried the weight of enclosure and age, even when the monument was new. The stones around the chamber were not casual walls. They were chosen, lifted, arranged, and marked. Human remains were placed within this space. The dead were present in some form, and the living entered their chamber at the turning of the year. That combination alone gives the morning a seriousness that does not need exaggeration. Then the horizon begins to change. Outside, the eastern edge of the world grows pale. The sun has not appeared yet, but the land knows it is coming. The cold is still there. The damp is still there. Someone probably shifts their weight from one foot to the other, because awe is one thing and winter ankles are another. The mound remains still. The entrance stone sits before the passage, its spirals and carved patterns waiting in the half-light. Above the doorway, the roof box is dark, a small opening that seems almost too modest for the task it's about to perform. Nothing about it shouts, it simply faces the right way. At sunrise, if the sky is clear, the first direct sunlight reaches the monument. It does not enter through the main doorway. That is one of the most remarkable details. The beam enters through the roof box, the carefully built opening above the entrance. This allows the light to pass over the lower doorway and travel along the passage. A practical mind can admire the solution immediately. A ceremonial mind can feel the effect. The sun is not merely shining into a hole. It is being guided through a designed route. The builders made an upper path for light, separate from the human path below. People enter through the doorway. The winter sun enters above them. The beam begins its movement along the passage. It travels through the narrow stone corridor that spends nearly all the year outside direct sunlight. The passage is around 19 meters long, which is long enough for the beam's arrival in the chamber to feel earned. Light does not simply appear, it advances. It finds the floor, the stones, the interior surfaces. Slowly the darkness changes. The chamber that has been enclosed and still begins to show itself. Details appear where moments before there was only shadow. Edges sharpen, surfaces warm in colour. The space wakes, not because anything inside has moved, but because the sun has reached it. That is the moment people come for now, and perhaps the moment people came for then. Direct sunlight can illuminate the chamber for about 17 minutes on a clear solstice morning. 17 minutes is not long. It is shorter than many errands, shorter than a delayed train announcement, shorter than the time some people spend deciding whether to answer an email that only needs the word yes. And yet inside Newgrange, those minutes carry an unusual weight. They are brief because the sun is moving and the alignment is precise. The light enters, holds, shifts, and fades. It does not stay. The chamber is visited, not occupied. This is one reason the event is so powerful. Modern life often treats light as something we control. We press a switch, we adjust a lamp, we brighten a screen. We turn night into working time and then wonder why our bodies look at us with deep disappointment. At Newgrange, light is not under human command. The builders prepared a way for it, but they did not own it. The sun comes from outside the monument, outside human society, outside any individual lifetime. It arrives because the world has turned and the year has reached its hinge. The monument can receive it. It cannot hurry it. For the people who built Newgrange, the illumination may have joined several meanings at once. It marked the winter solstice. It entered a place associated with the dead. It showed that the sun had reached its turning point and would begin its return. It may have renewed a bond between the living and their ancestors. It may have confirmed the order of the year. It may have been part of a larger ceremony in the Boyne Valley, connected to feasting, gathering, and community identity. We cannot reduce the event to a single modern sentence. Ancient rituals rarely fit well into simple labels, especially when the people who practiced them did not leave us their own explanations. But the architecture is strong evidence that this sunrise mattered. You do not build an opening, a passage, and a chamber around an accident. The phrase wakes up is useful because it describes what appears to happen, but it also needs gentle handling. Newgrange is not sleeping in a literal sense. It is a built monument, not a creature under a grassy blanket, though after 5,000 years one could forgive it for wanting a rest. What wakes is the relationship built into it. The alignment becomes active. The hidden chamber receives light. The architecture reveals its purpose. For most of the year, visitors can understand Newgrange as a tomb, a mound, a work of engineering, and a prehistoric site. On the solstice morning, it becomes something else as well, a functioning event. The monument does not simply exist, it performs, and it performs slowly. That is important for the tone of the experience. Nothing bursts open, no stone door swings wide, no golden statue rises from the floor, which is probably for the best from a conservation perspective. The awakening is quiet, a beam of sunlight, a dark chamber, a small opening doing exactly what it was made to do. The simplicity is what makes it convincing. If the effect were more theatrical, it might feel less ancient. Instead, it feels like a careful agreement between builders and sunrise. The people are gone. The agreement remains. Today, witnessing the real solstice illumination from inside the chamber is difficult, because space is limited and demand is high. Only a small number of people can be inside, and those places are allocated through a selection process. This modern arrangement is practical, but it also unintentionally preserves something of the original intimacy. Newgrange was never a place where thousands could crowd into the chamber. The inner experience has always belonged to a few bodies at a time. Everyone else must imagine, watch from outside, or see a recreation. There is a strange fairness in that. The monument was built on selective light, and even now access to that light is selective too. Outside the monument on solstice mornings, people may gather in the cold, waiting for the sun to rise over the Boyne Valley. Some are there for archaeology, some for spirituality, some for curiosity. Some because it is one of those rare places where a person can stand in the present and feel the deep past nearby without needing to force the feeling. The crowd today is modern in every obvious way, with coats, phones, cameras, live streams, and probably someone thinking very seriously about coffee. But the basic act is old. People gathering in winter to watch the sun return. Strip away the technology and there is continuity. Not exact sameness, but continuity. The weather can still decide the day. If clouds cover the horizon, the beam may not appear. The monument remains aligned. The roof box remains ready. The chamber remains in place, but the visible illumination is hidden. This can feel like disappointment, especially for people who have waited a long time to be there. Yet even a cloudy solstice morning at Newgrange has meaning. The event is not only the beam itself, but the waiting for it. The knowledge that the alignment exists. The recognition that beyond the clouds the sun has still risen at the turning of the year. Ancient people knew cloudy mornings too. They were not living in a perfectly clear documentary reconstruction with tasteful lighting and no mud. They would have known the difference between the expected event and the visible event. They may have gathered more than once. They may have understood that the sky sometimes keeps its evidence behind a curtain. If the sunlight does appear, the emotional effect can be difficult to explain, without sounding more dramatic than one intends. It is only light after all. We see light every day. It falls on kitchen tables, pavements, windowsills, rivers, and the half-finished tasks we meant to deal with yesterday. But context changes light. Sunlight in a chamber built before the pyramids, entering at the darkest turn of the year through a carefully made opening, is not ordinary household brightness. It is sunlight with a history. It is the same physical phenomenon that warms a wall or wakes a garden, but here it carries the memory of human intention across 50 centuries. The first people who saw it after construction may have known the builders personally. Perhaps some of them had helped move stones or carve patterns. Perhaps they had watched the roof box being finished and had wondered whether the alignment would work exactly as intended. Perhaps the solstice morning was a confirmation, a relief, a triumph, and a ceremony all at once. Later generations would have experienced it differently. For them, The monument may already have belonged to ancestors. The builders themselves may have become part of the remembered dead. Each generation standing at Newgrange would have inherited not only the structure, but the expectation that the sun would return to it. That inheritance is easy to underestimate. A monument aligned to a yearly event teaches people to return. It builds memory into the calendar. You do not have to write down the date if the community knows when the dark reaches its limit and the light comes to the chamber. People remember because the place gives them a reason to remember. In that sense, Newgrange may have worked not only as a tomb or a solar monument, but as a social anchor. It drew attention back to a shared moment in the year. It made time communal. The solstice was not merely happening somewhere in the sky. It was happening here, in this mound, in this passage, among these stones, with these people. The idea of a monument waking once a year also changes how we think about waiting. We often treat waiting as empty time. Waiting for transport, waiting for messages, waiting for water to boil, waiting for someone to finish telling a story that has somehow developed 3 unnecessary side roads. But at Newgrange, waiting is part of the design. The monument waits through the year. The chamber waits in darkness. The people wait before sunrise. Even the light, in a sense, waits until the Earth's tilt and orbit bring it back to the correct angle. The event exists because not everything is available at once. Timing gives it meaning. This is very different from most modern monuments. Many are meant to be seen at any time. A statue stands in daylight, rain, or evening traffic, making roughly the same statement whenever you pass it. Newgrange is visible all year, of course, but its most famous interior event belongs to a narrow window. Its deepest message is seasonal. It says that some things become clear only when the time is right. That is not abstract philosophy forced onto stone. It is how the building works. Come too early and the light is not there. Come too late and it has gone. Come under clouds and you may have to accept the hidden version. The monument teaches through conditions. There is also a practical beauty in the fact that the solstice event happens in the morning. The year turns in darkness, but the sign of that turning is sunrise. The chamber is not lit at noon when the sun is high and obvious. It is lit by low early light, the first direct brightness of the day. Dawn already carries a sense of beginning because every day starts there, but at the winter solstice, dawn also belongs to the returning year. Newgrange takes that ordinary beginning and places it inside a chamber of the dead. Morning enters memory, light enters stone, the year enters itself again. One can imagine the beam fading as the sun climbs higher. The angle changes. The line of light withdraws from the chamber. Shadows reclaim the surfaces. The passage returns to its normal condition. Whatever ceremony followed may have continued outside or elsewhere. Perhaps people ate together. Perhaps they spoke of the ancestors. Perhaps they mark the morning with actions that have left no clear trace in the ground. The monument had done its part. The sun had entered. The darkness had been interrupted. The community had witnessed the turning. That fading is just as important as the arrival. If the light stayed all day, the event would lose its shape. Because it leaves, it becomes memorable. Because it is brief, it asks to be awaited again. The chamber's return to darkness is not a failure. It is part of the cycle. Newgrange does not wake once and remain awake. It wakes, receives the light, and becomes still again. That stillness carries the event forward into memory. People can leave knowing that the sun has touched the chamber and that the year has begun its slow climb back toward longer days. For us, looking back, the solstice morning at Newgrange is both archaeological evidence and human story. It proves that the builders understood the sun's seasonal movement well enough to create a precise alignment. It shows that architecture could be used to frame time. It suggests that the darkest part of the year was connected with ceremony, the dead, and renewal. But beyond those careful statements, it also lets us feel something more basic. Human beings have always looked for signs that darkness is not permanent. We have watched horizons, lit fires, told stories, built calendars, raised monuments, and reminded one another that the light returns. Newgrange is one of the oldest surviving forms of that reminder. As the solstice morning passes and the valley brightens, the mound becomes once again a monument in daylight. The grass shows its colour. The stones lose their dawn shadows. The river continues nearby. People move, speak, take photographs, warm their hands, or stand quietly with the feeling that they have seen something both simple and difficult to hold. Inside, the chamber is dark again, but not empty of meaning. It has been lit briefly, as intended. The year has turned. The monument has kept its appointment, and from here, the story begins to widen beyond stone and sunlight into the old tales that later gathered around the Boyne Valley, where gods, heroes, and other worldly beings found their own ways of explaining why certain places feel too charged to be merely landscape. After the solstice light fades and the chamber returns to darkness, Newgrange does not simply become silent again, not completely. Places like this gather stories the way old stones gather lichen. Some stories are built into the monument from the beginning, in the passage, the chamber, the carved spirals, and the careful line toward winter sunrise. Others arrive later, carried by people who came long after the original builders were gone. People who no longer knew exactly who had raised the mound or why, but who still understood that this was not an ordinary hill. They looked at Newgrange, at Noath, at Dowth, at the great curve of the Boyne Valley, and they did what human beings so often do when a place feels too important to leave unexplained. They told stories. This is where we must walk carefully, because there is a difference between archaeology and mythology. Archaeology studies physical traces, stones, bones, tools, dates, soil layers, alignments, and the marks people left behind without necessarily intending to explain themselves to us. Mythology is a different kind of evidence. It preserves memory, imagination, belief, politics, poetry, and identity, often written down much later than the events or places it describes. The Irish myths connected with Newgrange were recorded in medieval manuscripts, thousands of years after the mound was built. That means we cannot simply take those tales and say, this is what the Neolithic builders believed. That would be too easy, and the past, like a badly packed suitcase, tends to resist being closed so neatly. But the myths still matter. They show us how later Irish tradition understood the Boyne Valley. They show that Newgrange remained powerful in the imagination long after its first meanings had become distant. And sometimes, even when a story is not a direct memory, it can still preserve the shape of awe. In Irish tradition, Brúna Boyne is not merely a collection of old tombs. It becomes a dwelling of the gods, a place connected with the Tuatha De Danann, the supernatural people of Irish myth. These beings are not quite gods in the simple textbook sense, and not quite fairies in the later delicate-winged picture book sense either. They are powerful, skilled, luminous, dangerous, clever, beautiful, and occasionally just as petty and complicated as anyone else with too much power and not enough supervision. In many stories, after being defeated by later human arrivals, the Tuatha De Danann retreat into the Cedar, the ancient mounds and hidden places of the landscape. These mounds become entrances to the other world, not necessarily a faraway heaven or underground kingdom, but a parallel realm close to ours, reachable at certain places, certain times, and under certain conditions. In that way, a monument like Newgrange could become not a dead relic, but a door. The Irish word brú can mean a mansion, palace, or great dwelling, and Brúna Boyne is often translated as the mansion, or palace of the Boyne. That alone tells us something about how later people saw the place. They did not look at the mound and think, ah yes, a large pile of prehistoric building material, how educational. They imagined a residence fit for beings of the other world. Newgrange, hidden beneath earth yet built with astonishing care, suited that role perfectly. A chamber inside a mound already feels like a threshold between worlds. Add the winter sun entering the darkness once a year, and it is not difficult to see why storytellers found it irresistible. If a place on Earth looked like it might open into something more than Earth, Newgrange was a strong candidate. One of the most important figures associated with Brunabóin is the Dagda, a great father-like figure among the Tuatha De Danann. He is often presented as powerful, large-hearted, earthy and immensely capable, a god with a club, a cauldron, deep knowledge, and an appetite that suggests ancient Ireland did not imagine divinity as overly concerned with portion control. He is not a distant, polished god who sits forever in perfect dignity. He is grand, but he is also physical and practical. He belongs to abundance, strength, magic, and cunning. In the stories connected with Newgrange, the Dagda is tied to the mound as a powerful owner or occupant of the brew, and his actions bring us into one of the most famous mythic episodes associated with the place. That episode involves Boann, the goddess connected with the River Boyne. Her name is woven into the landscape itself. The river is not just water flowing through the valley. In myth, it carries personhood, story, and divine presence. Boann appears in different tales and variants, sometimes connected with the creation or naming of the river, sometimes with the Dagda, and often with the deep mystery of sacred water and knowledge. In one story, Boann approaches a forbidden well, a source of wisdom where hazelnuts fall and salmon gain knowledge. She circles it, and the waters rise, pursue her, and become the river. This is not geography in the modern scientific sense, of course. It is a mythic explanation, a way of saying that rivers are not merely channels of water, but forces with origin, danger, knowledge, and identity. In the Newgrange story, Boann is married to Elkmar, who is associated with the brew. The Dagda desires her, and because mythological affairs are rarely organised with a sensible conversation and a shared calendar, he sends Elkmar away on an errand. Then the Dagda and Boann come together. To hide what has happened, the Dagda causes time itself to behave strangely. In some versions, he makes the sun stand still so that 9 months pass, as if they were one day. Boann conceives and gives birth to Engus, or Engus Og, the young god, on that same day. This is a striking story anywhere, but it becomes especially interesting at Newgrange, because here we have a monument famous for the behaviour of sunlight at a turning point in the year. A tale in which a god manipulates the sun and time around the brew feels almost as if later myth is circling the same strange territory as the architecture. Light, timing, birth, concealment, and a place where ordinary rules are briefly suspended. We should not say that the myth directly explains the Neolithic solstice alignment. It was written down far too late for that kind of certainty. But the resonance is hard to ignore. Newgrange is a place where the winter sun enters dark chamber. The myth of Wengus is a story where the sun's movement is halted, time is folded, and a child of extraordinary nature is born. Both the monument and the myth are concerned in different ways with the control or bending of time. That does not prove a direct line from the builders to the medieval storytellers, but it shows that the place continued to invite stories about time, light, and transformation. Newgrange had already been doing that in stone for millennia. Later tradition did it in words. Oengus himself is one of the most appealing figures in Irish mythology. He's often associated with youth, love, beauty and poetic charm, the kind of figure who sounds delightful until you remember that mythic youth and beauty often come with a talent for complicated property disputes. His connection to Newgrange is especially strong because of the story of how he comes to possess the brew. The tale goes something like this. When the Dagda divides his lands among his children, Wengus is away or overlooked depending on the version. When he returns and finds that no share has been set aside for him, he asks his father if he may have the brew for a day and a night. The Dagda agrees, but in Irish, as in many languages, a phrase can carry more than one meaning. A day and a night can mean one full cycle, but it can also be understood as all days and all nights. Wengus keeps the brew forever. It is a wonderful trick, and also a reminder that in myth, language can be as sharp as any weapon. Oengus does not storm the mound with an army, he wins it with wording. Anyone who has ever agreed to terms and conditions without reading them may feel a small ancestral shiver here. The story turns Newgrange into a legal, magical, and verbal conquest. The mound becomes the permanent dwelling of the youthful god, gained through cleverness and the flexible edges of speech. This may seem playful, but it also speaks to the importance of place. The brew is worth claiming. It is not a spare mound on the edge of things. It is a residence of power, a home fit for a divine figure. There is something very fitting about Oengus, the young god, dwelling in a monument associated with the winter solstice. At midwinter, the old year reaches its darkest point, and the returning sun begins its slow renewal. A place where light re-enters darkness becomes, in later story, the home of youth. Again, we must be cautious. Myth does not work like an archaeological label, but the association feels natural. Newgrange already stages a yearly return. Oengus embodies youth and renewal. The stories do not have to be literal memories to feel like they belong in the same valley. The Boyne Valley itself is full of this layering. It is a real landscape with fields, riverbanks, roads, farms, visitor paths, and weather that pays no attention to mythology. But it is also a story landscape. The River Boyne carries the name and presence of Boann. The mounds are linked to the Tuatha De Danann. Nearby Tara, not far away in County Meath, became associated with kingship and the High Kings of Ireland. The region is not just a cluster of archaeological places, it is a landscape where later Ireland placed power, origin, sovereignty, and otherworldly presence. Ancient stones became the bones of story. The land did not have to be invented in imagination because it was already there, quietly insisting on significance. Kings enter this world not only as historical rulers, but as figures shaped by myth and ceremony. In early Irish tradition, kingship was deeply tied to the land. A true king was not merely someone who held power. He had to be in right relationship with the territory, with fertility, justice, and the unseen forces that sustained order. The idea of sovereignty could be imagined as a woman, a goddess, or a personified land who grants legitimacy. This is not directly a Newgrange story in the same way the tales of the Dagda, Boann and Oengus are, but it helps us understand why the wider Boyne region could become so charged with royal and sacred meaning. A landscape containing ancient mounds, a great river, and nearby royal centres naturally became a place where power was told through story. Newgrange itself, however, remains more otherworldly than royal in the strict sense. Its mound form made it easy for later people to imagine it as a seed, a fairy mound or dwelling of the hidden people. The word fairy can be misleading today because it has been softened by later folklore and children's stories. The beings of the Sidhe are not tiny decorative creatures designed to sit on flowers and behave themselves. They are powerful, unpredictable, and best treated with respect. In Irish folklore, the fairy mound is not a cute place. It is a threshold. People may hear music from within. Time may pass differently. A person may enter and return changed, or not return at all. The other world is close, but it is not casual. This is where the title of otherworldly doors becomes more than a metaphor. A mound like Newgrange has an actual entrance leading into darkness. It is physically a doorway into the earth. For the Neolithic builders, that doorway led to a chamber connected with the dead and the winter sun. For later storytellers, such an entrance could become a route into the Sida, the hidden palaces of the Tuatha De Danann. The same architecture supports both experiences. A passage into a mound can be a tomb entrance, a ceremonial route, a solar instrument, and a mythic door, depending on who is approaching and what world of meaning they bring with them. The stone does not change, but the story does. There is a lovely human practicality in that. People rarely leave powerful places alone. If they do not know the original meaning, they do not shrug and say, "Unresolved data, How unfortunate. They keep the place alive through new meanings. This is not ignorance, it is continuity of attention. Newgrange may have lost its Neolithic explanations, but it did not lose its importance. Later communities felt that the mound mattered, and mythology gave them a way to say so. The gods moved in. The river became a goddess. The old chamber became an otherworld residence. The winter light became part of a larger sense that time and ordinary reality were not entirely stable here. The story of Angus and the day and night trick also fits beautifully with Newgrange's relationship to time. A god asks for a limited stay and receives forever. The wording turns a day into all days. At the monument, one sunrise becomes a yearly event repeated across thousands of years. A brief beam lasts only minutes, yet the appointment itself endures for millennia. Both the myth and the architecture play with scale. One day can become eternity. A few minutes of light can carry 5,000 years of meaning. A narrow opening above a doorway can connect a chamber to the turning of the planet. It is almost as if Newgrange encourages the mind to loosen its grip on ordinary time, though not so much that we forget where we put our shoes. Medieval writers who recorded these tales were living in a Christian world, and that matters too. The myths as we have them were filtered through scribes, scholars, monasteries, political concerns and literary traditions. They preserved older material but also shaped it. By the time the stories were written, Newgrange was already unimaginably old. The people recording the tales were much closer to us in time than they were to the builders of the monument. That thought can be startling. A medieval Irish scribe writing about Angus at Brunaboyne may have seemed ancient to us, but to the mound he was a late visitor. Newgrange had already watched thousands of years pass before those stories found their manuscript form. This long delay does not make the myths unimportant. It makes them part of Newgrange's afterlife. Monuments have lives after their original use. They are reused, renamed, feared, honoured, quarried, protected, misunderstood, and loved. Newgrange's mythological life shows that it continued to occupy the imagination. People did not have to know its Neolithic builders to sense that it belonged to something beyond the ordinary. In fact, the loss of the original story may have made room for new ones. When a place is visibly ancient but not fully explained, it becomes a natural home for gods. And that may tell us something about the human need for depth in landscapes. A field is not always just a field. A river is not always just moving water. A mound is not always just earth over stone. When people live with a place long enough, they attach memory to it. They tell children stories about it. They warn one another not to disturb it. They connect it with heroes, spirits, kings, ancestors, or strange lights seen at inconvenient hours by someone's cousin's neighbour, who was absolutely not exaggerating. Over generations, these stories thicken the landscape. They make it socially and emotionally inhabited. The Boyne Valley is one of those places where archaeology and mythology both insist that the land is dense with meaning. For a sleepy science journey, myth can be a dangerous path, because it is easy to drift too far into certainty or too far into fantasy. The safer and more interesting route is to let myth and archaeology stand beside one another without forcing them to become the same thing. Archaeology tells us that Newgrange was built around 3200 BCE, that it functioned as a passage tomb, that it was aligned to the winter solstice sunrise, that it contained human remains and megalithic art. Mythology tells us that later Ireland imagined Brunaboyne as a palace of the gods, the home of Wengus, a place of the Dagda and Boan, a doorway into the other world. The two are not identical, but they meet in the same mound. There is a kind of respect in allowing that meeting to remain slightly unresolved. We do not need to claim that the story of Wengus is a direct memory of the solstice ceremony. We do not need to dismiss it as mere legend either. It is part of the monument's cultural history, part of the way human beings kept responding to Newgrange. The mound generated attention in stone first, and then in story. It drew builders, mourners, observers, myth-makers, scribes, antiquarians, archaeologists, tourists, and winter solstice watchers. Each group arrived with different questions. Each left something behind, even if only an interpretation. The gods of the Boyne Valley, then, are not distractions from the archaeology. They are evidence of Newgrange's continuing power. A place forgotten completely does not become the palace of a god. A mound with no grip on the imagination does not gather stories of time stopping, divine births, clever bargains, and otherworldly doors. The myths show that people looked at Newgrange and felt it deserved a larger explanation than ordinary language could provide. They may not have known who built it, but they knew it was not common. As the story moves from the solstice chamber into the wider mythic valley, Newgrange becomes both more familiar and more strange. More familiar because myths are full of recognisable behaviour: desire, jealousy, cleverness, inheritance, longing, and the occasional questionable decision made by someone with supernatural authority. More strange because these ordinary emotions unfold among gods, rivers, mounds, and altered time. That combination is very human. We place our own feelings into larger forms so they can be carried across generations. The Dagda's desire, Buan's river, Wengus's youth, the otherworld beneath the mound, all of these make the landscape speak in human terms while keeping its ancient depth. And all the while, the physical monument remains. The passage still points toward winter sunrise, the chamber still waits in darkness, the entrance stone still carries its spirals, the roof box still admits light when the conditions are right. Myth did not erase the engineering, and engineering does not cancel the myth. One belongs to stone, the other to story, and Newgrange has room for both. That is one reason it continues to fascinate. It can be studied with measurements and dates. It can be approached through tales of gods and otherworldly dwellings. It can be visited as heritage, contemplated as ritual architecture, and experienced as a quiet place where the past feels unusually close. Leaving the mythic stories for a moment does not mean leaving wonder behind. In fact, the myths prepare us to look again at the builder's sky knowledge with fresh attention. The later tales speak of gods who bend time, hold the sun, claim days and nights, and live behind doors in the earth. The archaeology shows people who watch the sun carefully enough to build a winter alignment that still works. Between those two ways of knowing, one in story and one in stone, lies the same steady fact. The Boyne Valley has long been a place where time was noticed, shaped, and given meaning. And from here, the next question becomes more practical, though no less remarkable. How did people without clocks, telescopes, written calendars, or modern instruments measure the sky so well that a beam of sunlight could find its way into the heart of a mound after 5,000 years? To understand how Newgrange works, we have to forget clocks for a while. Not completely, of course, because if we forgot clocks too thoroughly, someone would miss dinner and civilization would begin to wobble at the edges. But for a moment it helps to step away from the kind of time that appears as numbers on a screen, divided into hours, minutes, seconds, reminders, deadlines, alarms, and the small panic of realizing a meeting began 3 minutes ago. The people who built Newgrange had none of that. They had no mechanical clock ticking on a wall, no written calendar pinned near a doorway, no telescope to magnify the horizon, no compass, no calculator, no astronomy app quietly informing them that sunrise would occur at exactly this time, weather permitting. And yet they built a monument that could receive the winter solstice sunrise with extraordinary care. That can sound almost impossible at first, until we remember that clocks did not invent time, they only learned to divide it. The sky was measuring long before humans gave the measurements names. The sun rose and set, the moon changed shape, stars shifted with the seasons, shadows lengthened and shortened, birds migrated, plants flowered, rivers flooded or fell. Animals changed behaviour. The year left clues everywhere, and ancient people lived close enough to those clues to notice them not as background decoration, but as information. A modern person might glance at the sky and say, "Lovely sunset," then return to a glowing rectangle. A Neolithic farmer might look at the same horizon and see a seasonal marker, a warning, a promise, or the memory of many previous evenings. The sky was not entertainment. It was a working part of life. The basic idea behind measuring the sun is surprisingly simple. The sun does not rise in exactly the same place every day. Over the course of the year, its rising point moves along the horizon. In the northern hemisphere, around the summer solstice, the sun rises farthest to the northeast and sets farthest to the northwest. Around the winter solstice, it rises farthest to the southeast and sets farthest to the southwest. Between those extremes, the sunrise slowly shifts day by day. If you watch from the same place over and over, the horizon becomes a kind of scale. The sun walks along it through the year, reaches one end of its journey, turns back, reaches the other, and turns again. You do not need a clock to see that. You need patience, memory, and a stable place to stand. That last part matters more than it sounds. To measure the sky, you need consistency. If you watch sunrise from a different hill every morning, while half asleep and distracted by whether the goats have escaped again, the pattern will be harder to detect. But if a community uses the same viewing place, the same notch in the horizon, the same standing stone, post, tree, ridge, or line of sight, then repeated observation becomes knowledge. One person may notice something, another may confirm it. Older people may teach younger people. Over many years, the movement of the sun becomes familiar, not in the abstract, but in a practical, embodied way. You know where the midwinter sunrise happens because you have seen it happen there, and because others before you saw it too. This kind of sky watching is not primitive science in the sense of being a rough early attempt at the real thing. It is science before instruments, if we use the word gently. Observation, comparison, repetition, memory, prediction. These are the bones of science. The tools were different, and the meanings were likely woven with ritual, ancestry, and ceremony, but the discipline of attention was real. The builders of Newgrange did not need a telescope to know the sun's annual limits. Telescopes are wonderful for distant objects, but the solstice sunrise is not distant in that sense. It is a horizon event. What matters is where the sun appears from a particular place. The instrument is the landscape itself. Imagine a person in the Boyne Valley watching the winter sunrise year after year. Perhaps not one person alone, because human knowledge is usually less lonely than we imagine. Maybe a group of people, maybe generations of observers, maybe those responsible for ritual timing, farming decisions or seasonal gatherings. They would see the sun rising farther and farther south as winter deepened. Each morning the change would be small, too small perhaps for a casual observer to notice daily, but across weeks the shift is clear. Then, near midwinter, something interesting happens. The movement seems to pause. The sun reaches its southern limit. For a few days its rising position changes very little. This is where the word solstice comes from in later Latin, meaning roughly the sun standing still. Of course, the sun is not actually standing still, and the earth is the one doing the tilting and orbiting, but from the ground the effect feels like a pause. The sun reaches the edge of its path and lingers before returning. For people who measured by watching, that pause could be harder to mark than we might think. The solstice is not like a bell ringing at midnight. The sunrise position changes slowly near the turning point, so the exact day is subtle. But subtle does not mean unknowable. With long observation, markers, and repeated practice, ancient sky watchers could identify the period of turning and perhaps narrow it very precisely. Newgrange's alignment suggests that its builders were not simply saying, winter happens somewhere over there. They were working with the low midwinter sunrise in a careful way. The passage and roof box do not respond equally to every sunrise. They respond to a small seasonal window when the sun rises at the correct part of the horizon and at the right low angle to send light inward. How might they have created such an alignment? We cannot watch them at work, which is inconsiderate of time, but we can think through the practical possibilities. One method would be direct observation from the site itself. Before the full mound was built, the builders could establish a line toward the midwinter sunrise. This might be done with posts, stakes, stones, or sighting positions. A person standing at the intended chamber location or entrance could observe where the sun appeared at the turning of the year, then mark that direction. Over time, the line could be refined. If a temporary wooden structure or stake line was used, it would leave little or no obvious trace after 5,000 years. Wood decays, holes fill, soil shifts, and future archaeologists are left trying to read whispers in the ground, while modern visitors ask where the cafe is. Another possibility is that the alignment was inherited from earlier observation points in the landscape. The site chosen for Newgrange may already have been known as a place where the winter sun rose in a meaningful direction relative to the horizon. The builders did not have to discover everything on the first day of construction. Knowledge can exist long before it becomes architecture. A community might know a sacred line of sunrise for generations, and only later decide to monumentalize it. In that case, Newgrange would not be the beginning of the observation, but its stone expression. The mound would turn remembered sky knowledge into a permanent structure. Horizon features may have helped. Ancient observers often use natural landmarks as markers. Hills, dips, ridges, notches, prominent trees, or distant features where the sun appeared at important times. The horizon around a monument is not a neutral backdrop, it is part of the system. The same sunrise viewed from different positions may appear in relation to different landmarks, which is why place matters so much. To align Newgrange, the builders had to understand sunrise from that particular location, not from Ireland in general. The winter sun had to be seen from the mound's place in the Boyne Valley. The architecture and the local horizon worked together. Shadows may also have taught ancient people a great deal. A vertical post in the ground, sometimes called a gnomon in later terminology, casts a shadow that changes through the day and across the year. At noon, shadows are shortest in summer and longest in winter. The direction and length of shadows can reveal seasonal change with great clarity. You do not need metal instruments for this. A straight post, a clear patch of ground, and repeated observation are enough to begin. People in many ancient cultures use shadow tracking in different forms, and it would be surprising if Neolithic observers did not notice such obvious patterns, even if we cannot say exactly how they use them at Newgrange. Shadows are slow teachers, but very reliable ones, provided the weather cooperates, which, once again, is a heroic assumption in Ireland. The moon may have mattered too, though Newgrange is most famous for the sun. The broader Brunna landscape includes other monuments and alignments, and the Neolithic sky was not divided neatly into a solar department and a lunar department with separate filing cabinets. The moon's phases, risings, settings, and longer cycles would have been visible to anyone who watched the night sky closely. The moon is especially useful for shorter rhythms because its changing shape marks time across the month. For farming communities, ritual groups and travellers, lunar cycles could help organise gatherings and activities. The sun gives the year its seasonal framework. The moon gives the night a changing count. Together they form a sky calendar long before numbers appear on paper. But Newgrange's most famous measurement is not a general calendar. It is an architectural capture of midwinter sunrise. That required more than knowing the direction of the sun. It required controlling light inside a built space. The roof box is the crucial element. Its placement above the entrance allows the sun's beam to enter at the correct angle and travel along the passage. If the opening had been too low, too high, too broad, too narrow, or aimed poorly, the effect would not work in the same way. The passage had to be long and straight enough to guide the light. The chamber had to be positioned where that light could arrive. The builders had to translate an observation of the horizon into a three-dimensional structure of stone, earth, and darkness. This is where the skill becomes especially impressive. Observing a sunrise is one thing. Building a mound around a narrow beam of that sunrise is another. A line on the horizon had to become a line through architecture, and architecture has problems. Stones are heavy. Ground is uneven. Construction changes the viewing conditions as it proceeds. The roof has to stay up. The passage has to remain open. The mound must not leak or collapse. If the alignment is slightly off, you cannot simply nudge the finished monument a little to the left, the way one might straighten a picture frame. A completed megalithic mound is not a flexible object. It does not respond well to, perhaps just move it a bit. The planning had to be careful before the weight became permanent. It is possible that the builders tested the alignment during construction. Perhaps the passage was left open, or partially open at certain stages. Perhaps temporary structures allowed them to confirm the light's path. Perhaps adjustments were made before the mound was sealed. We do not know the exact sequence, but the success of the final result suggests that observation and building were connected throughout the process. The monument may have been made through trial, memory, correction, and skilled judgment rather than a single perfect blueprint. Modern people often imagine ancient precision as either miraculous or mathematical in our sense. But there is another kind of precision, craft precision, the precision of someone who has worked with materials long enough to know how they behave, the precision of a farmer reading weather, a sailor reading wind, a carpenter judging wood, a potter judging clay, or a builder judging stone. It is knowledge held in eye, hand, and habit. That kind of knowledge can be very accurate without being written down. In fact, much traditional knowledge survives exactly that way. People can navigate by stars, predict seasonal changes, classify plants, track animals, make medicines, build boats, and manage landscapes through learned practice passed across generations. Writing is powerful, but it is not the only form of intelligence. The builders of Newgrange belong to an oral world, and oral worlds are not empty of structure. They use memory differently. Songs, stories, repeated ceremonies, place names, and teaching practices can carry information with remarkable durability. A solstice alignment could have been remembered not as a technical specification, but as a sacred direction, a story, a duty, a route for the sun. This is important because when we ask how ancient builders measured the sky without clocks, we may be assuming that clocks are the natural centre of timekeeping. They are not. Clocks are one way of measuring time, especially short intervals within the day. But the sky measures longer rhythms directly. A clock can tell you that it is 7:42 in the morning. The horizon can tell you where the year is. A watch can measure minutes. The sun's rising point can mark seasons. Newgrange belongs to that older kind of timekeeping, where time is not chopped into identical units, but recognised through returning relationships. Sun to horizon, light to passage, darkness to chamber, winter to renewal. There is also a social side to measuring the sky. A single observer can notice patterns, but a monument turns observation into shared knowledge. Once Newgrange was built, the winter solstice sunrise was no longer only something visible to a trained watcher on a horizon. It was built into a place where others could experience it. The architecture made sky knowledge communal. It said, in effect, this is the line, this is the turning, this is where the light comes. The monument became a teacher. Even someone who did not personally track the sunrise all year could stand at Newgrange and witness the result of long observation. That is a powerful use of architecture. It stores knowledge in stone and releases it through experience. The same thing happens in many kinds of buildings. A church, mosque, temple, or observatory can encode direction, orientation, and meaning. A doorway can face a holy city. A window can admit light on a feast day. A city grid can follow a ritual axis. A house can be built to catch winter warmth or avoid summer heat. Buildings are never just walls. They arrange human life in relation to larger patterns. Newgrange does this at a very deep level. It arranges death, darkness, community, and sunrise into a single event. The measurement is not separate from the meaning. It is the meaning's method. We should not imagine the builders standing around with modern astronomical vocabulary. They did not speak of axial tilt, declination, azimuth, or orbital mechanics. Those are later ways of describing what happens. but people can understand a phenomenon well enough to use it without explaining it in modern terms. You do not need to know the chemistry of yeast to bake bread, though it helps if the bread is being unusually emotional. You do not need to know the physics of combustion to keep a fire. You do not need heliocentric astronomy to observe that the sun returns to the same winter rising point. The builders knew what they needed to know, and they built from that knowledge. At the same time, we should not understate their achievement by saying they merely noticed the sun. Everyone notices sunrise. Not everyone turns a sunrise into a functioning monument that remains meaningful after 5,000 years. The difference lies in attention organised across generations. It lies in selecting a place, establishing a direction, moving materials, shaping a passage, placing a roof box, enclosing a chamber, and trusting that the sky's pattern will continue. That is more than casual observation. It is long-term commitment to a relationship with the heavens. The accuracy of Newgrange also depended on the shape of the sun itself. The sun is not a point of light. It has a visible disk, and near the horizon its apparent position is affected by atmospheric refraction, which slightly bends light. Ancient builders did not need to calculate refraction, but they would have observed the sun as it actually appeared. Their alignment would have been based on real sunrise, not theoretical diagrams. This is another reason repeated observation matters. The sky as experienced includes haze, horizon height, weather, and the sun's disk rising gradually. Newgrange was built for that lived sky, not for a clean geometry problem in a textbook. There is something reassuring about this. The monument's precision is not cold or detached. It is based on watching the world carefully as it appears from the ground. The builders did not step outside nature to measure it. They stood inside it. They felt the cold, saw the low sun, worked in the same weather that could later hide the solstice beam. Their astronomy was not separated from the body. It was done with eyes, feet, breath, memory, and seasonal need. The sky was measured by people who lived beneath it. And beneath that sky, the Boyne Valley offered a stable stage. The river curved through the land. Hills and horizons held their shapes across human lifetimes. The sun returned. The community remembered. Over time, knowledge could become more formal, perhaps guarded or taught by certain individuals. Some people may have had special roles as observers, ritual leaders, or keepers of seasonal knowledge. We cannot name them, and we cannot know their titles if they had any. But complex monuments often imply complex social knowledge. Someone had to know when the alignment mattered. Someone had to help make sure the structure respected it. Someone had to notice if a proposed wall, slab, or roof detail would interfere with the light. The sky watcher and the builder may have been the same person, or they may have worked together. Either way, Newgrange required a conversation between observation and construction. It is worth imagining how young people might have learned these patterns. Not through a lesson called astronomy at 9 a.m, followed by pottery and a short break for snacks, though snacks are always plausible. More likely, learning happened by participation. Children and younger adults watched elders watch the sky. They heard stories about the years turning. They joined seasonal gatherings. They learned the horizon the way they learned paths, plants, animals, and family histories. Knowledge was embedded in life. By the time they were adults, the movement of the sun may have felt as familiar as the movement of the river, not because it was simple, but because they had grown up inside its repetition. This helps explain why Newgrange feels both astonishing and natural. It is astonishing from a modern perspective because we are used to instruments doing the work of attention for us. We consult devices. They tell us sunrise, sunset, moon phase, weather, location, direction. This is useful, and no one needs to feel guilty about enjoying a good forecast, especially when laundry is involved. But it also means many of us have outsourced our relationship with the sky. We know the time without knowing the light. We know the date without noticing where the sun rises. Newgrange comes from a world where those things could not be outsourced. Attention was necessary. The monument is what long attention looks like when given stone. Yet ancient measurement was not perfect in every modern sense, and it does not need to be. We should avoid turning Neolithic people into either simple villagers or impossibly advanced astronomers. They were skilled observers with their own aims. Newgrange was not an observatory in the modern scientific sense, designed to gather neutral data about celestial mechanics. It was a passage tomb aligned to a major solar event, likely serving ceremonial, social and ancestral purposes. Its measurement was precise because the event mattered, not because someone was trying to publish a paper on solar declination. The purpose was lived before it was analytical. There is a calm beauty in that. The monument measures the sky by welcoming the sun at the right moment. It does not count the year aloud. It does not display numbers. It simply changes. For most of the year, the chamber remains beyond direct sunlight. Near midwinter, the beam enters. That is the measurement. Not a dial, not a clock face, not a ticking hand. A change in darkness. A line of light where there usually is none. A brief confirmation that the year has reached its turn. This kind of timekeeping is easy to miss because it is not busy. Modern clocks are always announcing themselves. They tick, blink, buzz, chime, vibrate, and occasionally make a sound so unpleasant that waking up feels less like a natural process and more like being summoned by an angry appliance. Newgrange says nothing for most of the year. Its timekeeping is silent until the right morning. Then sunlight enters. The restraint is part of the design. It measures not by constant display but by rare event. As we think about the builders measuring the sky without clocks, perhaps the most important word is not measurement but relationship. They were not measuring from outside the world. They were relating to it. The sun's path mattered because it shaped life. The solstice mattered because darkness and light mattered. The monument mattered because memory, ancestry and community mattered. The sky was not an object above them only. It was part of the order in which they lived. Newgrange was their way of making that order visible, at least for a few minutes each year, and once the line was built, it outlived them. That is the extraordinary thing. A person can watch the sun for a lifetime and then disappear from memory. A community can pass on knowledge for generations and still eventually lose its language, names and stories. But a structure like Newgrange can preserve a piece of that attention long after the observers are gone. The roof box still faces the winter sun, faces the passage still holds the direction. The chamber still receives light when the sky allows. The builder's eyes are gone, but the line they found remains. This is where the practical and the moving become almost the same. The ancient builders measured the sky without clocks because they had something better suited to their purpose. A horizon, a community, repeated seasons, memory, patience, and the will to build. They did not need numbers glowing in the dark. They had the dark itself, and they learned when the light would enter it. And as the story moves onward, that ancient knowledge does not simply stay locked in the Neolithic world. It passes through long centuries of forgetting, folklore, disturbance, rediscovery, excavation, restoration, and debate, until the modern world begins, slowly and not always neatly, to understand what the mound had been doing all along. For a monument so old, Newgrange has had a surprisingly eventful modern life. It spent thousands of years in the Boyne Valley, known in the landscape, remembered in story, visited, reused, altered by time, and slowly covered by the ordinary processes that turn human structures into hills if given enough centuries and a generous supply of grass. By the time early modern people began to take written notice of it again, Newgrange did not look like the crisp, managed heritage site visitors see today. It was a large mound, overgrown and weathered, impressive in shape but not fully understood. Its entrance had become hidden. Its interior was not part of everyday knowledge in the way it once may have been. The monument was still there, but in a sense it had withdrawn. That is a strange thing to say about a mound made of stone and earth, but ancient places can disappear without moving. They disappear when their original names are forgotten. They disappear when their purpose is no longer known. They disappear when their entrances close, their stones slip, their carvings are covered, and the people living nearby explain them through new stories, because the old explanations have gone quiet. Newgrange never vanished from the land. It was too large for that. But it did pass from one kind of knowledge into another. It moved from Neolithic ceremony into myth, from myth into local landscape, from landscape into antiquarian curiosity, from curiosity into archaeological investigation, and from archaeology into world heritage. That is quite a journey for something that has spent most of its life standing still. The modern rediscovery of the entrance is usually dated to 1699, and it began not with a careful scientific survey, but with something much more ordinary and slightly alarming: people looking for stone. The mound was used as a convenient source of building material, which is the sort of sentence that makes modern conservationists feel faint and reach for a very strong cup of tea. Workers quarrying stones from the mound uncovered the entrance and revealed that this grassy rise was not merely a pile or natural hill, but contained a passage and chamber. The landowner Charles Campbell became associated with this discovery, and soon the site attracted the attention of antiquarians, including the Welsh scholar Edward Llwyd, who recorded details of what had been found. It is easy to wince at the idea of people digging into such a monument for construction stone, and perhaps we should. Yet it is also worth remembering that the past is often rediscovered through untidy accidents. Many ancient sites have been found by farmers, builders, quarrymen, road workers, and people doing something practical for reasons that had nothing to do with archaeology. Someone drains a field and finds a trackway. Someone digs foundations and uncovers a burial. Someone looks for stones and opens a passage into a 5,000-year-old monument. History is not always found by a scholar in a clean hat holding a clipboard. Sometimes it is found by a labourer who has just realised the hill is more complicated than expected. The early antiquarians who visited Newgrange were fascinated, but their understanding was limited by the knowledge of their own time. They measured, described, speculated, and sometimes guessed quite confidently in the wrong direction, which is a long human tradition and not confined to antiquarian studies. Some saw the monument through biblical frameworks, some through classical comparisons, some through ideas about ancient peoples that now feel more imaginative than accurate. But even mistaken interpretations can preserve important observations. Early descriptions recorded features, stones, carvings, and finds that later researchers could compare with the monument's changing condition. In that sense, the antiquarians were both limited and useful, like a candle in a draughty room. Not enough to illuminate everything, but better than darkness. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, Newgrange became increasingly known as an ancient curiosity and an important monument. Visitors came, scholars wrote about it, artists drew it, measurements were taken. The mound entered a world of books, learned societies, and debate. Yet the monument itself was not always well protected. Its passage was accessible, stones were worn. People could enter in ways that would make modern site managers develop an urgent twitch. The chamber, once sealed within ceremonial darkness, became a destination for explorers, visitors, and the simply curious. This is another reminder that preservation is not automatic. A site can be famous and still be vulnerable. In fact, fame often brings more feet, more hands, and more opportunities for damage, especially when everyone would like to see the interesting bit inside. By the 20th century, it was clear that Newgrange needed serious archaeological attention and conservation. The major modern excavation and restoration was led by Professor Michael J. O'Kelly of University College Cork, beginning in 1962 and continuing through the mid-1970s. This work transformed modern understanding of the monument. O'Kelly's excavations studied the mound, passage, chamber, curbstones, art, structure, materials, and surrounding evidence in far greater detail than earlier generations had been able to do. Archaeology by then had become more systematic. though still shaped by the methods and assumptions of its time. The work at Newgrange was not a quick clearing out. It was a long campaign, season after season, with recording, interpretation, consolidation, and decisions about how the monument should be presented and preserved. One of the most important outcomes of O'Kelly's work was the recognition and demonstration of the winter solstice alignment. The roof box above the entrance had been identified as a special feature, and O'Kelly famously observed the sunrise illumination in the chamber during the winter solstice period. This confirmed that the builders had deliberately oriented the passage and designed the opening to admit the low midwinter sun. For modern archaeology, this was a remarkable moment. It turned a structural feature into a working piece of ancient sky knowledge. The monument was no longer only a tomb with interesting carvings and impressive stones. It was also a solar monument, designed to produce an event at a particular time of year. There is something almost theatrical about that rediscovery, though the drama was real and quiet. Imagine being an archaeologist who has spent years studying a monument already known to be extraordinary, and then realizing that the winter sunrise still enters the chamber as the builders intended. It is not simply finding an object in the soil. It is seeing a 5,000-year-old arrangement come alive. A pot can be held, a bone can be dated, a carved stone can be drawn. But a solstice alignment has to happen. It is evidence that arrives as light. That must have been a rare kind of archaeological experience, the sort that makes even a careful scholar feel, for a moment, that the past has answered back. The restoration of Newgrange, however, is where the story becomes more complicated. Excavation is not only discovery, it often forces choices. Stones have shifted, earth has collapsed. Earlier disturbance has altered contexts. Visitors need safe access. The monument needs protection from weather and wear. Archaeologists and conservation authorities must decide what to stabilise, what to reconstruct, what to leave exposed, what to cover, and how to present the site to the public. These choices can never be entirely neutral. They shape what future visitors believe the monument looked like and how they experience it. At Newgrange, the most visible and debated choice is the reconstructed front facade of white quartz and rounded granite stones. Today, Newgrange is famous for that bright curved front, the pale quartz wall rising above the entrance and extending across the face of the mound. It is striking, almost dazzling in certain light, and for many visitors it has become part of the monument's identity. But this facade is also controversial. During excavation, large quantities of quartz and other stones were found at the front of the mound. O'Kelly interpreted them as having originally formed a near-vertical revetment or wall that had collapsed outward. Based on this interpretation, the facade was reconstructed in a way that presents the quartz as a high, bright front wall. Some later archaeologists have questioned whether the original Neolithic arrangement really looked like that. They have suggested the quartz may instead have formed a sloping surface, a spread, a pavement, or some other arrangement less vertical than the restoration we see today. This debate is important, not because it ruins Newgrange, but because it reminds us that restoration is interpretation made visible. When an archaeologist writes an interpretation in a book, readers can compare it with other interpretations. When an interpretation is rebuilt in stone, it becomes part of the visitor's experience. It can look authoritative simply because it is physically there. People stand before the white facade and assume they are seeing the Neolithic monument exactly as it was. But the truth is more careful. They are seeing a modern restoration based on archaeological evidence and a particular interpretation of that evidence. It may be partly right, largely right, or wrong in some details. The debate continues because the evidence can be read in more than one way. That does not mean the restoration was careless. It means the problem was difficult. When O'Kelly's team worked at Newgrange, they faced a monument that needed excavation, stabilisation, and presentation. They had to decide how to deal with collapsed material and how to protect the passage and chamber for the future. The choices they made reflected the evidence they had and the conservation philosophy of the time. Today, conservation thinking often favours minimal intervention and clearer distinction, between original fabric and reconstruction. But every generation of archaeologists inherits not only ancient sites, but previous decisions made about those sites. It is very easy to stand decades later with new methods, new theories, and a comfortable chair and say what should have been done differently. It's harder to make decisions in mud, with stones shifting, budgets tightening, visitors arriving, and rain behaving as if it has been personally invited to the excavation. The reconstructed roof box has also been discussed and studied because it is central to the solstice event. The feature above the entrance, as reconstructed and interpreted, allows the sunlight to reach the chamber. Some researchers have examined whether the roof box as presented today accurately reflects its original form and ritual use. Again, the debate is not simply about whether Newgrange is important. Everyone serious about the site agrees that it is. The question is how best to understand the details of its architecture and the sequence of its construction, use, collapse, discovery and restoration. Ancient monuments do not come to us untouched. They arrive with damage, repairs, gaps, soil movement, previous digging, and modern expectations all wrapped together like a parcel no one labelled properly. The interior too required care. The passage stones and chamber had suffered from centuries of access, water, and wear. Stabilising such a structure is delicate. Too little intervention, and the monument may deteriorate. Too much, and the ancient character may be compromised. Conservation is always a negotiation between keeping a place alive and keeping it itself. If no one can enter, the monument is protected but distant. If everyone can enter freely, the monument may be loved to pieces, which is still destruction, just with better intentions. Newgrange today is managed through controlled access, guided tours, and visitor systems that try to balance public experience with preservation. This is not as romantic as a solitary wander into the chamber at dawn, but it is much better for the stones, and stones, having survived 5,000 years, deserve some say in the matter. Newgrange's modern presentation also changed how people imagine the site. The visitor centre, pathways, guided interpretation, solstice lottery, photography, documentaries, and online images have made the monument globally recognisable. It is no longer only a place in a field known to locals, scholars, and dedicated travellers. It is part of the shared heritage imagination. People who have never been to County Meath know the image of the white facade, the carved entrance stone, the dark passage, and the beam of winter light. This is powerful, but it can also flatten complexity. A famous image can make a place seem simpler than it is. Newgrange becomes the mound that lights up at solstice, and while that is true, it is not all it is. It is also a tomb, a ceremonial landscape, an art site, a restoration debate, a mythic dwelling, a conservation challenge, and an unresolved question. The UNESCO World Heritage status of Brúna Bóin, granted in the 1990s, placed Newgrange within an international framework of protection and recognition. This matters because Newgrange is not an isolated object. It is part of a wider archaeological landscape including Noath, Dowth, smaller mounds, standing stones, henges, and other features, some visible and some hidden beneath fields. The modern heritage approach increasingly emphasises landscape, rather than single monument. That is a useful correction. Newgrange is extraordinary, but it makes more sense when seen as one element in a dense ceremonial region. If we focus only on the famous solstice beam, we may miss the broader world of monuments around it. It would be like judging an entire library by the one book everyone photographs. Archaeology around Brúna Bóin has continued to develop. New surveys, excavations, aerial photography, geophysical methods, and scientific analysis have revealed features that earlier researchers could not see. Dry summers, changing crop marks, and remote sensing have sometimes shown hidden shapes in the landscape. Enclosures, possible henges, and traces of activity long buried. This is one of the quiet pleasures of archaeology. The past is not finished being discovered. Even at a famous site, new methods can reveal new questions. A place can be studied for centuries and still have things to say, though usually not in a straightforward tone. Scientific advances have also brought new kinds of evidence. Radiocarbon dating helped place the monument in the Neolithic. Analysis of human remains, materials and environmental evidence continues to refine the picture of who used the site and how it fitted into wider networks. Ancient DNA studies in recent years have added striking new questions about social organisation and elite status in Neolithic Ireland, especially from remains associated with Newgrange. These findings must be handled carefully because they are complex and still subject to interpretation. But they remind us that archaeology is not only about stones, it is also about people, relationships, ancestry, diet, movement, and the structure of society. A mound is a doorway into all of that, if the evidence is read cautiously. And still, mystery remains. Not the kind of mystery that requires us to abandon reason and invite in every theory wearing a dramatic cloak. The real mysteries are better. Why exactly was Newgrange built in the form it was? Who was allowed inside? What did the carvings mean to the people who made them? How did ceremonies unfold there? Were the solstice mornings witnessed by many or few? Did the meaning of the monument change over generations of Neolithic use? How did Newgrange relate to Noath and Douth in practice, not only in modern maps? How were the dead selected for placement within such monuments? What stories did the builders tell about the winter sun, if stories were told? What did they call the place? What did they feel when the light entered? These questions are not empty gaps waiting to be filled with fantasy. They are the proper edges of knowledge. Archaeology can answer many things, but not everything. It can tell us what was built, often when it was built, how materials were used, where remains were placed, and what patterns can be detected. It can compare sites, test samples, map landscapes, and revise old assumptions. But it cannot fully reconstruct a vanished mind. It cannot restore a Neolithic voice, speaking in its own language about what the solstice meant. It cannot give us the emotional texture of a ceremony from 3200 BCE with complete certainty. That loss is frustrating, but it is also honest. The past is not ours to possess completely. In a way, the restoration debates make Newgrange more interesting, not less. They show that the monument is not a frozen fact, but an active field of interpretation. The white facade, the roof box, the passage, the mound profile, the surrounding features all invite questions about evidence and reconstruction. Visitors may want certainty, and one can understand why. It is comforting to stand before an ancient monument and be told exactly what it looked like, exactly what it meant, and exactly how people used it. But Newgrange is too old and too complex for that kind of tidy certainty. It gives us strong facts and careful probabilities, then asks us to live respectfully with the rest. That is not a failure of science. It is science doing its job without pretending to be magic. Good archaeology does not remove all mystery. It removes bad mystery. It clears away impossible claims, careless fantasies, and assumptions that underestimate ancient people. In their place, it gives us richer questions. We no longer need to wonder whether Newgrange was built by people capable of sophisticated planning. It was. We no longer need to guess whether the winter solstice alignment matters. It does. We no longer need to see the mound as a simple heap or a random tomb. It is far more structured than that. But once those things are understood, deeper questions remain about meaning, experience, and memory. Modern Newgrange, then, is a layered place. The Neolithic builders made the original monument. Later communities wrapped it in myth. Early modern quarrying accidentally opened it again. Antiquarians measured and guessed. Archaeologists excavated and restored. Conservation teams manage and protect. Visitors arrive with wonder, cameras, hopes, and sometimes very cold hands at solstice. Each layer changes the way the site is known. None of them completely replaces the others. When you look at Newgrange today, you're seeing not only the Stone Age mound, but also the history of rediscovery, interpretation, and care that has allowed it to remain visible. There is something comforting about that, because it means Newgrange is not trapped in the past. It continues to have a life. Not the original life, of course. The Neolithic ceremonies are gone. The builder's language is gone. The first meanings are partly lost. But the monument still gathers people. It still teaches attention to the sky. It still raises questions about death, time, community, and the return of light. It still makes visitors slow down, at least for a while, and look at stone with more patience than usual. In a world where so much is quickly consumed and forgotten, that is no small achievement. The remaining mystery is perhaps why Newgrange affects us so strongly, even when we know we cannot fully know it. We can read the dates, we can learn the excavation history, we can understand the restoration debates, we can study the solstice alignment. But then we imagine the dark passage, the cold dawn, the beam of light, and the people who built for a future they would never see, and something in the mind becomes quiet. It is not ignorance, it is recognition. We recognize that human beings have always tried to make meaning out of change. We recognize the desire to mark the turning of darkness toward light. We recognize the need to place the dead within a continuing order. We recognize the urge to build something that says, this moment matters. Newgrange's rediscovery did not solve the monument, it reopened it. The excavation did not end the questions, it made them more precise. The restoration did not return us to the Neolithic morning. It gave the modern world a way to encounter the site, while also leaving room for debate about what was changed and what was preserved. That is the honest state of things. Newgrange remains both known and unknown, both studied and mysterious, both a monument of stone and a monument of interpretation. It has survived long enough to remind us that understanding does not always mean finishing the story. And now, after passing through rediscovery, restoration, and the careful uncertainties that still surround the mound, the story begins to turn inward again, not only into the chamber, but into what the place does to our sense of darkness and light. Because perhaps the deepest lesson of Newgrange is not hidden in one disputed wall, one carved spiral, or even one winter sunrise. It may be in the way the monument teaches us to wait, to notice, and to trust that even the longest night belongs to a larger pattern. After all the stones, stories, measurements, restorations, and winter dawns, Newgrange leaves us with something quieter than a single answer. It leaves us with a way of thinking about darkness, light, and time that feels very old and still surprisingly useful. Not useful in the ordinary modern way, like a good umbrella, a reliable kettle, or a phone charger that has somehow not wandered off into the mysterious domestic void. Newgrange is useful in a slower way. It reminds us that darkness is not always emptiness, that light is not always ordinary, and that time is not only something measured by clocks. Sometimes time is a chamber waiting in silence. Sometimes it is a beam of sunlight arriving after a year of absence. Sometimes it is a human decision that continues working 5,000 years after the people who made it have gone. There is a simple lesson in the structure of Newgrange, and it begins with darkness. The chamber spends most of its year without direct sunlight. It does not fail because of that. It does not become meaningless because it is dark. In fact, the darkness is part of what gives the solstice light its power. If the chamber were always bright, the winter sunrise would not feel like an arrival. If light entered every morning, there would be no particular reason to gather for the shortest day. The builders understood, whether practically, ritually, or both, that darkness can prepare a place. It can make attention sharper. It can make a small change matter. It can hold expectation. That may be difficult for us, because modern life often treats darkness as something to be corrected. We light our streets, our rooms, our screens, our dashboards, our shops, our cities, and occasionally our gardens in ways that suggest even shrubs should be available for viewing at all hours. Light is useful, of course. It keeps us safe, helps us work, and prevents the ancient household ritual of walking into furniture at night. But when light becomes constant, we can lose the feeling of its return. Newgrange belongs to a world where darkness was not an inconvenience to be solved by a switch. It was a season, a condition, a fact of life, and perhaps a place where meaning could gather. Inside Newgrange, darkness is not random, it is built. The long passage, the enclosed chamber, the mound of earth and stone, all create an interior where light cannot casually enter. This means the solstice beam is not simply sunlight finding a gap, it is sunlight admitted by design. The monument teaches that light can be more powerful when it is not constant, when it arrives through waiting, when it comes at the moment the world has turned. There is nothing vague or sentimental about that. It is how the architecture works. The chamber is dark, the sun reaches the correct place, the beam enters, the space changes. The lesson is physical before it becomes emotional. Still, it is difficult not to feel the emotional weight. The winter solstice comes when the year has narrowed to its shortest daylight. For ancient farming communities, the return of the sun carried real importance. It was tied to survival, season, food, animals, crops, and the confidence that winter would not be endless. For us, the stakes may be different, especially if our greatest winter challenge is finding the end of the tape on a roll of gift wrap. But the feeling remains recognisable. Everyone knows something about dark seasons, even if not always in the sky. There are times when days feel shorter than they should, when life seems to close inward, when the next bright thing is not yet visible. Newgrange does not pretend darkness is easy. It simply shows that darkness can be part of a larger pattern. That is an ancient kind of comfort, and it is not the same as saying everything is fine. The builders of Newgrange were not naive about winter. They lived close to its difficulty. The monument does not erase the longest night. It marks it. It faces it directly. It places the return of light not in summer, when brightness is abundant, but at the lowest point of the sun's path. There is a steadiness in that. The monument says, in stone rather than speech, that the turning happens from within the dark season, not after it has politely finished and tidied itself away. This is where Newgrange becomes more than an archaeological wonder. It becomes a reminder about patience. The monument does not rush the year. It does not demand that the light arrive early because everyone is tired of waiting. It does not perform on command. It waits through the full cycle. Spring growth, summer height, autumn decline, winter deepening, then the solstice. Its great event depends on the whole year moving as it must. The beam enters only because the planet has taken its long path around the sun and returned to the proper angle. In a world trained to expect immediacy, that is almost radical. Newgrange asks us to imagine meaning that ripens slowly. The people who built it understood time differently from us, though not because they were less intelligent. They lived with time in forms that were visible and bodily. The swelling of seeds, the fattening of animals, the lengthening of shadows, the changing moon, the cold returning, the sun rising in a different place along the horizon. Their time was not divided into identical digital units. It was seasonal, relational, and tied to work and ceremony. Newgrange did not tell them the hour. It told them something deeper and slower. The year has turned. The light has returned. The pattern continues. Our own time can feel thinner by comparison. We know exactly what time it is and still often feel out of time. We can measure seconds with extraordinary precision, but lose track of the seasons beyond whether it is too hot, too cold, or unexpectedly both in the same afternoon. We live by calendars packed with tasks, but the older rhythms continue underneath us. The body still responds to light and dark. Moods still shift with seasons. Sleep still listens to the sun more than we sometimes admit. Plants still grow on their own schedule despite any impatience we may bring to the garden. Birds migrate, rivers rise and fall, trees leaf and shed, and somewhere in County Meath, Newgrange still waits for a winter sunrise. That continuity is one of the monument's quiet gifts. It reminds us that human beings are not separate from planetary time. We may build cities, schedules, and technologies, but we are still carried around the sun. Every birthday, every anniversary, every winter, every spring is Earth completing and repeating a motion older than memory. Newgrange makes that motion visible in one small, golden event. It takes the vast mechanics of orbit and tilt and turns them into light on stone. That is not a metaphor first. It is an achievement of architecture. The planet moves, the sun rises, the beam enters, and the chamber brightens. There is another lesson in the fact that Newgrange was built by people whose names we do not know. Modern culture often attaches meaning to individual fame. We want names, portraits, biographies, signatures, credit. Newgrange gives us almost none of that. We do not know the name of the person who first proposed the alignment. We do not know who carved the entrance stone. We do not know who carried the quartz, who placed the roof box, who supervised the chamber roof, who complained about the weather, who made a joke at exactly the wrong moment, or who stood there on the first successful solstice morning with relief in their chest. Their identities are gone. Their work remains. This can feel sad, but it can also feel strangely freeing. Newgrange is a monument to shared human intention rather than individual fame. It shows what people can make when knowledge, labour, belief, and patience are held by a community. No single life was long enough to give the monument all the meanings it would gather. No builder could witness all the future solstice mornings. Yet they built anyway. They made something that would outlast their names, their houses, their language, and almost everything else in their world. The monument does not remember them as biographies. It remembers them as alignment. That is a different kind of immortality. Not personal immortality, not the survival of a face or a title, but the survival of an act, a decision held in stone, a line aimed at sunrise, a chamber made dark enough for light to matter. The builders could not have imagined us exactly, with our cameras, guidebooks, live streams, scientific dating methods, waterproof jackets, and the small modern tragedy of low phone battery at a historic site. But they did imagine future recurrence. They built something meant to work again. They trusted that the sun would return and that people after them would care. And people did care, though in changing ways. Later generations wrapped Newgrange in myth. Antiquarians opened and described it. Archaeologists excavated and debated it. Conservators protect it. Visitors arrive year after year. The meanings have shifted, but the attention has continued. This is another lesson of time. Nothing survives unchanged, and yet survival still matters. Newgrange is not preserved in a perfect Neolithic bubble. It has been disturbed, restored, interpreted, argued over, and reimagined. Its present form includes modern choices. Its past includes unknowns. But the monument's central relationship with midwinter sunrise remains strong enough to reach us. Time has changed Newgrange, but it has not silenced it. The remaining mysteries are not problems to be swept away. They are part of why the monument continues to hold attention. If we knew everything about Newgrange, if every carving came with a caption, and every ceremony had been recorded in a helpful ancient handbook, something would be gained, certainly. Scholars would be delighted. Documentary writers would sleep better. But something might also be lost. The uncertainty asks us to approach with humility. It prevents us from turning the builders into characters who exist only to confirm our theories. We know enough to respect their skill. We do not know enough to claim their inner world completely. That balance is healthy. It lets wonder and evidence stand together. The darkness inside Newgrange, then, is also the darkness of what we cannot fully know. There are gaps in the record, missing words, lost gestures, meanings that slipped away long before anyone thought to write them down. But just as the chamber's physical darkness is not empty, this historical darkness is not empty either. it contains traces. Stones, bones, carvings, alignments, materials and myths. Archaeology sends careful beams into that darkness, not lighting everything at once, but revealing enough for the shape of the place to emerge. The past is never fully illuminated. It is visited by light. That may be the gentlest and most accurate way to think about Newgrange. Not as a solved riddle, not as an unsolved puzzle, but as a place visited by light in more than one sense. Sunlight visits the chamber at midwinter. Research visits the ancient structure with questions and methods. Myth visits the mound with gods and otherworldly doors. Visitors come with curiosity, hope, and sometimes a very cold nose. Each kind of light reveals something and leaves something in shadow. Newgrange can hold both. It also teaches that time is not only linear. Of course, in ordinary life, time moves forward. Breakfast does not politely return after being eaten, and yesterday does not open again just because we left something useful there. But Newgrange shows time as cycle as well as sequence. The solstice returns. The sun's rising point moves and comes back. The chamber brightens, darkens, and waits. The year folds around again. The people who built it lived and died, but the event they prepared repeats beyond them. Linear time carries individuals away. Cyclical time brings the season back. Newgrange stands where those two kinds of time meet. This may be why the monument feels both ancient and immediate. Its builders are gone into deep history, but the next solstice is never far away in cosmic terms. The event belongs to the past, because it was designed 5,000 years ago. It belongs to the present, because it can still be witnessed. It belongs to the future, because if the monument is protected and the sky is clear, the light will come again. Few places make time feel layered so simply. A stone chamber, a sunrise, a year turning, and suddenly the distance between then and now feels less like a wall and more like a long passage. There is comfort in the fact that the same sun connects all these moments. Not exactly the same light, of course. Each sunrise is new, but the same star, the same planetary motion, the same seasonal geometry. The people who built Newgrange saw the winter sun rise over the Boyne Valley. We see it too, or at least we can imagine it from their monument. The landscape has changed, the languages have changed, the meanings have changed, but the sun's return remains legible. That continuity is humbling. It places human history inside something larger, without making human effort seem small. In fact, it makes the effort more moving. Tiny creatures on a turning planet noticed the pattern and built a home for one beam of light. And what a patient home it is. Newgrange does not explain itself quickly. It asks us to slow down enough to understand why a few minutes of sunlight could matter. It asks us to imagine a world without written calendars, where the sky itself was the calendar. It asks us to accept that ancient people could be practical and spiritual, skilled and uncertain, local and connected, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. It asks us to see darkness not as failure, but as the condition that allows light to arrive with meaning. It asks us to respect time not only as something we spend, save, waste, or lose, but as something we inhabit. So perhaps the lesson of Newgrange is not that the past was mysterious because people were unlike us. Perhaps it is mysterious because people were like us in ways that survived beneath all the differences. They watched the year change. They feared loss. They honoured the dead. They gathered in important places. They turned observation into memory. They wanted reassurance that darkness would pass. They built something that would make the return of light visible, not just for themselves, but for those who came after. That is deeply human. More human, perhaps, than any grander explanation. And now, as our own quiet journey through Newgrange begins to settle, it is worth returning to the question from the beginning. Where are you listening from tonight, and what kind of light is outside your window? Is it late where you are, with the room dim and the world softening around the edges? Is it morning, with the day beginning its ordinary demands? Is it winter, summer, or some in-between season where the weather has clearly misplaced its instructions. Wherever you are, the planet is turning. The sun is rising somewhere, setting somewhere else, and the old rhythms continue underneath the busy surface of our days. If this journey through the Boyne Valley brought you a little calm, a little wonder, or simply a slower way to end the day, I would be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and shared this quiet space with someone else who might enjoy resting their thoughts among ancient stones for a while. Newgrange has waited through more than 5,000 winters, so it understands the value of patience. It reminds us that not every important thing arrives loudly. Sometimes it comes as a narrow beam of light, crossing a dark passage at dawn, touching a chamber for a few brief minutes, and then leaving the silence changed. So rest now, fellow traveller, wherever the year has found you. The longest night is never the whole story. The chamber may be dark, the stones may be still, and the morning may seem far off, but somewhere beyond the horizon, the light is already on its way.